They told her the blind beggar could not see the terror on her face. They forgot that some men learned to recognize fear long before they learned mercy. At 4:12 in the morning, Serafina Valewood woke to the sound of fists pounding against her bedroom door hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. She sat upright instantly, heart slamming against her ribs, tangled in thin blankets that smelled faintly of lavender and old smoke. For one disoriented second, she thought the creditors had finally come to drag the family furniture into the street. Then her aunt's voice sliced through the darkness. "Get up. They are already here." Serafina closed her eyes. Cold rushed through her body before her bare feet even touched the floorboards. Outside her bedroom window, the world was still black. Rain streaked the glass in crooked silver lines. Somewhere downstairs, carriage wheels cracked through puddles in the gravel drive. "Serafina," Beatrice Valewood's voice sharpened. "Do not embarrass me today. Today." The word settled like iron in her stomach. She stood slowly and wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The room looked smaller than ever in the weak candlelight. Narrow bed, cracked mirror, faded wallpaper peeling near the corners. 3 months ago this house had still felt alive. Now it felt like a corpse waiting to be buried. Her father's debts had eaten everything. The horses first, then the silver, then the paintings. Last week, 2 men carried her mother's piano out through the front door, while Aunt Beatrice stood in the hallway pretending not to cry. Serafina had not cried either. She had learned very young that grief became dangerous when cruel people saw it. The pounding came again. "You have 10 minutes, Beatrice snapped, "and wash your face. You look sickly." Sickly. Serafina almost laughed at that. Of course she looked sickly. She had not eaten a full meal in 4 days. She crossed the room and stared into the cracked mirror above the washstand. A pale girl stared back at her. 20 years old. Ash blonde hair hanging loose around narrow shoulders. Gray eyes too tired for someone her age. There was a faint bruise beneath her left wrist where Aunt Beatrice had grabbed her the night before when Serafina refused to sign the marriage papers quickly enough. She covered it with her sleeve automatically. The house groaned around her. Pipes rattled inside the walls. Wind pressed against the windows like something trying to get inside. She remembered standing in this exact room at 14 years old while her mother brushed her hair and promised her she would marry for love someday. Her mother had been dead less than a year later. Fever. 3 terrible nights. After that, Aunt Beatrice moved into the house with perfume sharp enough to choke a room and opinions sharp enough to bleed one dry. By 16, Serafina understood her future had stopped belonging to her. 5 minutes, Beatrice called. Serafina inhaled slowly. Then she opened the wardrobe. The wedding dress hanging inside was ivory satin trimmed in yellowed lace. It had clearly belonged to someone else once. The waist sat too tight, the sleeves too short. She touched the fabric carefully anyway. There was something humiliating about wearing a stranger's wedding dress to marry a stranger no one would even name properly. Blind beggar. That was all anybody called him. Nobody seemed to know where he came from. Only that he arrived in town 6 weeks ago with a black cane, damaged eyes, and enough money to settle every Valewood debt overnight. Serafina still remembered the exact expression on Aunt Beatrice's face when the offer arrived. Relief. Pure, ugly relief. "He is willing to overlook your lack of prospects," her aunt had said while folding the letter with trembling hands. "You should feel grateful. Grateful." Serafina dressed silently. The satin scratched against her skin. Outside the door she could hear servants hurrying through the hallway downstairs. Nervous footsteps, whispering voices. The entire house had become a machine powered by panic. She finished buttoning the sleeves herself because there was nobody left to help her anymore. The maids had all quit 2 weeks ago after the coal merchant threatened legal seizure. By the time Serafina stepped into the hallway, dawn still had not arrived. The manor sat in darkness broken only by candles flickering along the walls. Aunt Beatrice waited at the top of the staircase wearing black silk and pearls she definitely could not afford anymore. Her narrow face tightened the moment she saw Serafina. "Pull your shoulders back," she said. "You look like you are walking to an execution." Serafina descended the stairs slowly. "Perhaps I am." Beatrice's eyes flashed. "Do not start." "I was not aware I still had the freedom to start anything." Her aunt moved closer instantly. The scent of roses and bitterness wrapped around Serafina like smoke. "Listen to me carefully," Beatrice whispered. "That man downstairs paid enough money to save this family from complete ruin. Whatever he is, whatever rumors you have heard, you will smile and do your duty." Serafina looked at her quietly. "And if I refuse?" Beatrice did not answer immediately. She did not have to. The silence itself carried the answer. Debtor prison. Ruin. Starvation. Public humiliation. Women without money did not disappear dramatically. They simply vanished one ugly piece at a time until nobody remembered they had existed. Beatrice adjusted Serafina's collar with sharp fingers. "You should consider yourself fortunate. Fortunate women are not sold before sunrise." Her aunt's mouth hardened. "Enough." Then softer, colder, she added, "Do not make me regret feeding you all these years." The words landed exactly where Beatrice intended them to. Serafina felt them like a bruise beneath the ribs. They descended the remaining stairs in silence. The drawing-room doors stood open below them. Firelight flickered across polished wood and fading gold wallpaper. Several men waited near the windows, speaking quietly among themselves. Lawyers probably. Witnesses. One priest with nervous eyes and damp cuffs. Nobody looked directly at her for long. They looked at her the way people looked at storms rolling across distant water. Curious. Relieved it was happening to somebody else. Then she saw him. He stood near the fireplace with one gloved hand resting lightly atop a black cane. Tall. Broad-shouldered beneath a dark wool coat cut too perfectly to belong to any beggar. His hair was black, touched faintly with silver near the temples. A thin scar crossed one side of his jaw. But it was his stillness that unsettled her most. He did not move like uncertain men moved. He stood like the entire room belonged to him already. His eyes lifted toward her. Pale gray, clouded enough to suggest blindness. Yet something inside her tightened painfully beneath that gaze anyway. Impossible. Blind men were not supposed to look at people like that. Aunt Beatrice immediately straightened beside her. "Your Grace." The room went silent. Serafina frowned slightly. "Grace." Her attention snapped toward Beatrice, but her aunt's expression changed too fast. Panic flickered across her face before disappearing beneath brittle politeness. "Forgive me," Beatrice said quickly. A slip of the tongue. The man said nothing for a moment. Rain hammered softly against the windows. Finally he spoke. "People usually reveal the truth by accident." His voice was low and rough like distant thunder. Not loud. It did not need to be. Every person in the room seemed to lean toward it automatically. Beatrice forced a strained smile. "Of course." Serafina stared at him. Something cold moved through her stomach. "Your Grace." Blind beggar. Neither belonged in the same sentence. The priest cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should proceed before the roads worsen." The man inclined his head once. "As you wish." Serafina noticed then that everyone in the room watched him before moving, as though waiting unconsciously for permission. Even the priest. Even Aunt Beatrice. The realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The ceremony took place in the manor chapel because the weather outside had turned vicious. Wind screamed through the old stone corridors while servants rushed ahead carrying candles. Serafina walked beside her future husband without touching him. She could feel his presence anyway. Heavy, controlled, dangerous in a way she could not explain. The chapel smelled like cold stone and wet wax. Tiny flames trembled beneath stained glass windows darkened by rain. Only 12 guests attended. Most of them creditors eager to witness the transaction they had forced into existence. Serafina stood before the altar gripping her gloves so tightly her fingers hurt. The priest began speaking. His voice echoed strangely against the stone walls. Serafina barely heard any of it. Her attention kept drifting toward the man beside her. Lucian. That was the only name he had given. No family name. No title. Nothing. Yet everything about him contradicted the story. His coat alone probably cost more than the remaining furniture inside Valewood Manor. His posture belonged to somebody raised around power. And despite those clouded eyes, he never once stumbled. Not once. "Do you take this woman?" The priest asked carefully. To be your lawful wife? Silence stretched for one long heartbeat. Then Lucian answered. I do. Serafina swallowed hard. His voice remained calm, steady, as though marrying a stranger at dawn meant absolutely nothing to him. The priest turned toward her. Miss Valewood. She opened her mouth. Nothing emerged at first. Rain battered the chapel roof overhead. Somewhere behind her, Aunt Beatrice inhaled sharply. Serafina suddenly realized everyone expected obedience. Fear. Tears. They expected a frightened girl being sold quietly into the dark. Something stubborn lifted inside her chest. Small. Bruised. Still alive. She raised her chin slightly. I do. The words tasted like surrender. The ceremony finished quickly after that. Rings exchanged. Vows spoken. A marriage completed before the sun fully rose. When the priest announced them husband and wife, nobody applauded. Nobody smiled. It felt less like a wedding and more like a contract being sealed underground. Lucian turned toward her slowly. Up close, the scar along his jaw looked older than she first thought. His pale eyes rested near her face with unsettling precision. Then very quietly, so only she could hear, he said, Do not look frightened. Serafina stiffened. I am not frightened. One corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. That was not criticism. Before she could answer, chapel doors burst open behind them. A young servant hurried inside pale with panic. Sir, he blurted out, the Cromere men are outside. Aunt Beatrice went white instantly. Lucian remained perfectly still. How many? 6. The servant swallowed hard. Maybe more. Serafina frowned. Cromere. Edmund Cromere owned half the debt contracts swallowing this county whole. Men whispered his name quietly in town taverns. Cruel lender. Ruthless collector. Lucian tapped his cane once against the chapel floor. Calm. Precise. Bring the carriage around. Yes, sir. The servant rushed away immediately. Aunt Beatrice grabbed Serafina's arm hard enough to hurt. You need to leave now. What is happening? Beatrice's eyes darted toward Lucian before lowering quickly. Nothing that concerns you anymore. Lucian extended his gloved hand toward Serafina. Come. She hesitated. Only briefly. But he noticed. Of course he noticed. Your aunt cannot protect you from men like Cromere, he said softly. Neither can this house. The brutal honesty of it cut deeper than comfort would have. Serafina placed her hand into his. His fingers closed around hers firmly. Warm despite the cold. Steady despite the storm raging outside. He guided her down the chapel aisle while candlelight flickered across stone walls and frightened faces. Nobody tried stopping them. Outside, dawn finally bled weak gray light across the horizon. Rain poured over the manor grounds in silver sheets. A black carriage waited near the steps pulled by 4 massive horses restless beneath the storm. 2 armed riders sat mounted nearby wearing dark coats trimmed in silver thread. Not servants. Guards. Serafina stopped abruptly beneath the rain. You said you were a beggar. Lucian turned slightly toward her. Water streaked across the sharp lines of his face. No, he said calmly. Other people said that. Thunder rolled across the hills. One of the mounted guards lowered his head the moment Lucian approached. Not respect born from fear alone. Loyalty. Deep enough to survive bloodshed. Serafina's pulse quickened painfully. She looked back once toward Valewood Manor standing dark against the storm. Home. Prison. Graveyard. She could not decide which anymore. Then Lucian leaned closer beside her and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear him above the rain. Before this night ends, he said, you are going to understand exactly why they were so desperate to give you away. The carriage door closed with a heavy sound that felt far too final for sunrise. Serafina sat frozen against the dark leather seat while rain hammered the roof overhead hard enough to drown out the world beyond the windows. Across from her, Lucian Mordain rested one gloved hand atop the silver handle of his cane and leaned back into the shadows as though silence itself belonged to him. The carriage lurched forward. Gravel cracked beneath the wheels. Valewood Manor disappeared behind curtains of rain without ceremony. No servant waved goodbye. No family member rushed after her. Serafina stared at the blurred window until the estate vanished entirely into gray fog. Then she realized something strange. She did not miss it. That realization frightened her more than the marriage itself. The carriage interior smelled faintly of cedarwood and cold iron. Nothing about it resembled the transport of a beggar. Thick wool blankets rested folded beside the seats. The leather beneath her fingertips was smooth and expensive. A lantern fixed to the wall cast warm amber light across polished brass fixtures. Even the windows were reinforced with etched silver trim. She had spent enough time around wealthy houses to recognize quality when she saw it. "You are very quiet," Lucien said. His voice cut through the steady rhythm of rain and wheels. Serafina looked toward him carefully. His pale eyes remained fixed somewhere near the opposite wall. Blind. Yet she had the growing sensation he noticed everything anyway. "Most brides are not taken from their homes before dawn by armed riders," she replied softly. "Perhaps not. And most beggars do not travel in carriages like this." His expression did not change. "You are observant. You lied to me." "No," he adjusted his gloves slowly. "Your family lied to you. There is a difference." Serafina folded her hands tighter in her lap. The bruise beneath her sleeve throbbed faintly with every bump in the road. Outside, dark pine forests slid past the carriage windows in blurred shadows. They had already left the main roads behind. She noticed that too. "Where are we going?" "North." "That is not an answer." One corner of his mouth moved slightly again. That almost smile she still could not understand. "It is the only answer you are getting for now." Rainwater streaked across the glass beside her. She studied him more carefully while pretending not to. Everything about Lucien contradicted itself. His clothes were plain black wool with no embroidery or visible family crest. Yet the stitching was flawless. His boots carried faint traces of mud from long travel, but the leather looked custom-made. Even his cane appeared less like support for blindness and more like something dangerous disguised as elegance. She noticed his hands next. Large, scarred faintly across the knuckles. Not the hands of a man who spent his life helpless. Men with those hands survived difficult things. "You keep staring," he said calmly. Serafina stiffened. "I was not aware blind men noticed staring." Silence settled between them for one dangerous second. Then Lucien leaned his head slightly toward her. "Blind men notice far more than people realize." A cold sensation moved slowly down her spine. She looked away first. The carriage rolled deeper into the storm. After several minutes, Lucien spoke again. "You are hungry." Serafina blinked. "What?" He reached beside him without hesitation and lifted a small wooden case from the seat. Again, perfectly precise. No fumbling. No uncertainty. He opened it and placed it between them. Bread, cheese, dried fruit. Warm tea secured carefully in silver containers. Her stomach tightened painfully at the sight. She hated that her body betrayed her so quickly. Lucien rested back against the seat once more. "Eat." Pride rose automatically inside her throat. Old instinct. Dangerous instinct. "I am not starving." No, his voice remained even. "You are simply swallowing too often because your stomach has been empty since yesterday afternoon." Serafina froze completely. He continued before she could answer. "Your aunt could not afford proper meals for weeks. The kitchen stores were nearly empty. The servants left because they had stopped being paid. You lost weight rapidly over the last month." His pale eyes shifted toward her with eerie accuracy. "Would you like me to continue?" She stared at him speechlessly. "How do you know those things?" "Because desperation leaves patterns." Rain thundered harder above them. Finally, very carefully, Serafina reached for the bread. Lucien said nothing while she ate. He did not watch her either. At least not visibly. Yet she still felt strangely observed. The tea burned warmly down her throat. She had forgotten what warmth felt like. By mid-morning the storm worsened. Wind rattled the carriage hard enough to shake the lanterns. Outside, the forests thickened into endless dark walls of pine and bare winter branches. Serafina eventually noticed something else. Every village they passed fell silent when the carriage appeared. People stopped talking. Shopkeepers lowered their eyes. Men standing beneath awnings removed their hats immediately. Nobody waved. Nobody approached. They simply watched the black carriage roll past like something they recognized and feared. Serafina leaned slightly toward the rain-streaked glass. "Why are they staring?" Lucian answered without hesitation. "Because they know this carriage." "How?" "People remember things that survive disasters." That was not an answer either. Frustration flickered beneath her ribs. "You speak like a riddle. And you ask dangerous questions quickly." "I married a stranger." "Yes. I think that gives me the right." Lucian fell silent after that. But not angry silent. Controlled silent. The kind of silence that felt chosen rather than emotional. Hours passed. The farther north they traveled, the colder the world became. Snow began mixing with the rain by noon. White streaks drifted across endless fields and frozen rivers. Serafina pulled the wool blanket tighter around herself while exhaustion settled into her bones. She had not slept properly in weeks. Not since the debt collectors started appearing at the manor after dark. She remembered one night in particular. Aunt Beatrice standing rigid beside the fireplace while two men in expensive coats discussed furniture valuations as though Serafina herself was another object waiting to be sold. One of them had looked directly at her and smiled. "Pretty enough," he had said casually. She could settle a fair amount if positioned correctly. She still remembered the feeling of that sentence against her skin. Lucian's voice interrupted her thoughts quietly. "You are trembling. It is cold." No, his tone remained calm. "You were remembering something unpleasant." Serafina's fingers tightened around the blanket instantly. "Can you hear thoughts now too?" "Not thoughts." He tilted his head slightly. "Breathing patterns." She stared at him again. Impossible man. Impossible marriage. Impossible silence. Outside, thunder rolled low across distant hills. The carriage slowed suddenly. One of the riders approached the side window. Serafina heard muffled voices beneath the storm before the rider moved away again. Lucian remained perfectly still. "What happened?" she asked. "Road inspection." "From whom?" "Men loyal to Edmund Cromere." Serafina's stomach tightened. "Why would they stop us?" "Because Cromere dislikes uncertainty." "And you?" This time Lucian answered immediately. "I dislike men who mistake cruelty for intelligence." The carriage continued forward. Serafina glanced toward the windows uneasily. "Will they follow us?" "Probably." "Should I be worried?" "You should always be worried." The bluntness startled a soft laugh out of her before she could stop it. Very small. Barely there. Yet the moment it escaped, Lucian turned toward her fully for the first time since sunrise. His pale eyes rested near her face. "There it is," he murmured quietly. Serafina frowned. "What?" "The sound your family spent years trying to remove." Something inside her chest tightened unexpectedly. Dangerous man, she thought again. Not because he frightened rooms into silence. Because he noticed things nobody else bothered seeing. She looked away quickly. Snow thickened outside the carriage windows. The world slowly transformed into white fields and black forests beneath a bruised sky. Late afternoon shadows began creeping across the road long before sunset. Then the carriage hit a deep rut suddenly. Serafina lost balance instantly as the wheels jolted hard against frozen ground. Before she could fall sideways, Lucian caught her wrist. Fast. Too fast. His grip steadied her easily. Warm fingers closed around the exact spot hidden beneath her sleeve. The bruised spot. Serafina inhaled sharply. Lucian went completely still. His thumb rested lightly against the injury without pressure. Then very quietly he said, "Who did this?" She pulled her arm back immediately. "It does not matter." His face revealed nothing. But something colder entered the silence around him. "It matters to me." Serafina stared at him uncertainly. Nobody had ever said those words to her before without wanting something in return. The realization unsettled her deeply. She shifted back against the seat. "It was nothing." Lucian said nothing further. Yet the atmosphere inside the carriage changed after that. He became quieter somehow. Sharper. Outside, dusk settled heavily across the northern roads. Then finally the carriage began slowing again. Serafina looked toward the windows. Through curtains of falling snow, enormous iron gates emerged from the darkness ahead, black, towering nearly 15 feet high. Two mounted guards waited beside them carrying lanterns that flickered gold against the storm. The moment the carriage approached, both men straightened instantly. One stepped forward and struck his fist sharply against his chest in salute. Not servant behavior. Military. The gates creaked open slowly. Beyond them stretched a long road vanishing into dense pine forests and rising fog. Serafina's pulse quickened. Where are we? Lucian rested his cane lightly beside him. Home. The carriage rolled through the gates. Behind them, iron slammed shut with a sound like judgment echoing through the storm. Serafina looked back instinctively toward the disappearing road. Then forward again into the endless northern fog swallowing the path ahead. And for the first time since the wedding ceremony, genuine fear finally began creeping slowly into her chest. The road beyond the gates seemed to swallow sound itself. Snow drifted thick through towering pine trees, while the black carriage rolled deeper into northern wilderness untouched by village lights or distant church bells. Serafina sat motionless beneath the lantern glow, listening to the steady crack of wheels against frozen ground and the occasional soft shift of Lucian's cane beside him. The farther they traveled, the stranger the silence became. No farms, no travelers, no sign of ordinary life, only endless forest and fog heavy enough to erase the world beyond a few yards ahead. "How far is your estate?" she finally asked quietly. Lucian turned his head slightly toward the window beside him. "Close. You answer questions the way priests answer sins. Carefully, annoyingly." That almost smile touched his mouth again. Small, brief, gone before she fully trusted it existed. The carriage climbed steadily uphill. Serafina noticed the guards outside growing more alert as the woods thickened. One rider repeatedly scanned the trees with his hand resting near the holster beneath his coat. Not nervous exactly, prepared. Lucian noticed her attention shift. "You are wondering why armed men escort a blind beggar through the mountains. You are not a beggar. No, and I suspect you are not truly blind either." Silence settled instantly between them. Heavy, dangerous. Snow hissed softly against the carriage windows. Serafina immediately regretted saying it aloud. Then Lucian spoke, calm as ever. "What makes you think that?" She studied him carefully. "You move too precisely. Habit. You knew exactly where the food case was earlier. I packed it myself. You never stumble. My condition is not total darkness." He answered too smoothly, too prepared. Serafina narrowed her eyes slightly. "And the way you look at people? How does a blind man look at people?" She opened her mouth, stopped, because she did not actually know. That realization irritated her more than it should have. Lucian leaned back into the shadows again. "Most people see what they expect to see." His pale eyes lifted toward her face with eerie accuracy. "That makes deception very easy." Before Serafina could answer, the carriage slowed sharply. Outside, one of the riders called something through the storm. Lucian immediately reached for the carriage door handle. Again without hesitation, Serafina watched closely this time. No searching, no uncertainty. His fingers landed directly where they intended. "What is happening?" she asked. "We stop here for the horses." "Here." Lucian opened the carriage door. Freezing wind tore instantly through the interior carrying snow and pine smoke. Serafina looked outside and saw a small stone outpost crouched against the mountainside beneath weak lantern light. 3 stable hands hurried through the storm leading fresh horses toward the carriage team. The men moved quickly, efficiently. One glanced toward Lucian and lowered his eyes immediately. Respect again. Fear too. Lucian stepped down first. Snow crunched sharply beneath his boots. He extended one gloved hand toward her without looking directly at her. Serafina hesitated only briefly before accepting it. His grip steadied her easily onto the icy ground. The cold hit her instantly. Brutal northern cold that clawed through fabric and settled into bone within seconds. The outpost itself looked ancient. Thick stone walls blackened by age. Narrow windows glowing dim gold through frost. Somewhere nearby, Horses snorted restlessly against the wind. Lucian released her hand once she steadied herself. "Inside," he said. "You will freeze out here." The stable hands practically flattened themselves against the walls as Lucian passed. None of them spoke above a whisper. Serafina noticed that too. She followed him into the outpost slowly, snow melting against the hem of her borrowed wedding dress. Warmth struck her immediately upon entering. Firelight flickered across rough stone walls lined with hunting rifles and heavy winter cloaks. A kettle hissed softly above the fireplace. Two older men seated near the hearth stood so quickly their chairs scraped backward against the floor. "Sir," one of them said quietly. Lucian inclined his head once. "Continue eating." Neither man moved until Lucian stepped farther inside. Then both sat again carefully without speaking. Serafina stared openly now. Nobody treated blind beggars this way. One young servant approached carrying dry towels with shaking hands. "For your wife, sir." "Wife." The word still felt unreal. Lucian accepted the towels without fumbling and turned toward Serafina. "Your hands are numb." She blinked. "How would you know that?" "You stopped flexing your fingers." He held out one towel calmly. "Dry them." She accepted it slowly. Warm fabric brushed against her frozen skin. The servant nearby kept staring at Lucian with open nervousness before quickly lowering his eyes again. Serafina caught the motion instantly. "What are they afraid of?" she whispered after the servant hurried away. Lucian removed his gloves one finger at a time. "Perhaps they are not afraid. That is definitely fear." He considered her words briefly. Fear and loyalty often resemble each other in isolated places. The fire crackled softly between them. Serafina rubbed warmth back into her hands while studying him more openly than before. Without gloves, the scars across Lucian's knuckles appeared more visible. Old pale lines crossing skin hardened by years of difficult work. Not aristocratic softness. Survival. His wedding ring glinted briefly beneath the firelight. Plain silver. No crest. No ornamentation. Strange for a man surrounded by obvious wealth. One of the older men near the hearth suddenly stood again and approached cautiously. "Roads east of Black Hollow were blocked this morning," he reported quietly. "Crowmer's men have been searching travelers since dawn." Lucian did not react visibly. "Any problems?" "No, sir." The man hesitated. "But they are asking questions about a woman." Serafina felt cold again despite the fire. Lucian rested one hand lightly atop his cane. "And what answers did they receive?" "Nothing useful." The older man glanced briefly toward Serafina before lowering his voice further. "No one here speaks to Cromere willingly." Lucian nodded once. "Good." The man immediately stepped back again as though dismissed without needing formal permission. Serafina waited until he returned to his chair before speaking. "Why would Edmund Cromere care where I am?" "Because your marriage disrupted his plans." "What plans?" Lucian's pale eyes shifted toward the fire. "Control. Over my family debts? Over your family." She stared at him carefully. "You speak as though he wanted more than money." Lucian remained silent. That silence frightened her more than answers would have. Outside, wind screamed across the mountain roads hard enough to rattle the shutters. Snow piled thick against the windows. One of the stable boys entered carrying fresh tea on a silver tray. Silver again. Everything around Lucian contradicted the image her family sold her. The boy placed the tray carefully near the fire before stepping back immediately. "Your tea, your grace." The room went dead silent. Serafina's breath caught instantly. The stable boy turned white. Lucian did not move at all. For one terrible second nobody breathed. Then the boy dropped to one knee so fast the teacups rattled. "Forgive me, sir. I did not mean—" Lucian lifted one hand slightly. The boy fell silent immediately. Calmly, almost lazily, Lucian reached for the tea tray and poured a cup without spilling a single drop. "Stand up," he said quietly. The boy obeyed at once. Serafina watched Lucian's hands carefully again. Perfect movements. Exact measurements. Not blind. Impossible. Lucian lifted the teacup toward Serafina first. "You should drink before we continue traveling." She ignored the tea. Your Grace. The title hung in the room like smoke. Nobody moved. Nobody looked directly at her. Lucian finally turned his face toward her slowly. Firelight flickered across the scar along his jaw. An old habit among the staff, he said evenly. They exaggerate. Do they? Yes. Because they seem absolutely terrified of making mistakes around you. His expression remained unreadable. Mistakes can become expensive in the north. Serafina stared at him another long moment before finally taking the tea. The porcelain cup warmed her hands instantly. Yet the warmth did little to settle the growing tension inside her chest. He was hiding something enormous. She could feel it now. Not just wealth. Not just power. Something darker. Older. The stable boy still looked pale beside the doorway. Lucian sipped his tea calmly while snow battered the windows harder outside. Then, without warning, he spoke softly enough that only Serafina could hear him. Do not ask questions about titles here. Her pulse quickened slightly. Why? Because frightened people speak carelessly. And Lucian's pale eyes settled near her face again. Careless words get remembered. A strange chill passed through her. Not threat exactly. Warning. Before she could press further, the door burst open again beneath a howl of wind. One of the mounted guards strode inside covered in snow. We need to leave now, he said sharply. Riders spotted 3 miles south. Lucian stood instantly. Fast. Smooth. Certain. Serafina watched closely this time as he crossed the room directly toward the doorway without touching walls or furniture once. No hesitation. No searching. He moved through space like a man who saw perfectly well. The guard moved aside immediately to clear his path. How many riders? Lucian asked. At least 8. Cromir. Probably. Lucian nodded once. Prepare the secondary route. The guard disappeared back into the storm. Serafina rose slowly from her chair. Secondary route? Mountain roads. Are they dangerous? Everything north of the border is dangerous. He reached for her coat hanging beside the fire and handed it directly toward her without fumbling. Again, perfect aim. Serafina took it carefully while staring at him openly now. Lucian sensed it immediately. You are still watching me. You handed me that coat without even turning toward it first. Perhaps I remembered where it was placed. Perhaps. Snow swirled violently through the open doorway behind him. Lucian stepped closer then. Not threatening. Somehow worse. Controlled. The firelight caught silver in his pale eyes as he lowered his voice. You are trying very hard to decide whether you should fear me. Serafina swallowed once. Should I? Silence stretched between them while wind screamed outside and distant horses stamped restlessly against frozen ground. Then Lucian answered softly. Not tonight. He offered her his hand again. Steady. Certain. Dangerous in ways she still could not fully understand. Serafina hesitated only a second before placing her fingers into his. His grip tightened gently around hers. Warm against the cold. Human despite everything unnatural surrounding him. Together they stepped back into the storm while the stable staff lowered their heads behind them in complete silence. And as the black carriage disappeared once more into the northern snow, Serafina realized something that made her pulse quicken with genuine fear for the first time since the wedding. Blind men did not move like kings, but Lucian Mordain did. By the time the carriage reached the mountains, night had swallowed the world completely. Snow drifted thick across the narrow roads while black pine trees rose like walls on either side of the path. Serafina sat rigid beneath the lantern glow, one gloved hand gripping the edge of the leather seat every time the wheels slid against hidden ice. The storm had worsened steadily over the last hour. Wind screamed across the cliffs hard enough to rattle the carriage windows. Somewhere outside, one of the horses let out a sharp nervous cry before the drivers pulled the team forward again. Lucian remained calm through all of it. Too calm. He sat across from her with his cane resting loosely beside him and one hand folded against the dark wool of his coat as though traveling through a mountain blizzard at night meant nothing at all. That frightened her almost as much as everything else. Men only became that calm when they had survived worse things already. The carriage lurched hard suddenly around a steep curve. Serafina caught herself against the wall with a sharp inhale. Lucien's hand reached out immediately. Not searching. Certain. His fingers wrapped lightly around her wrist to steady her before she fell forward. Again that impossible precision. Again that terrible awareness hidden beneath clouded silver eyes. "Careful," he said quietly. She pulled her arm back slower this time. "You always know exactly where I am. You breathe loudly when you are nervous. I do not. You are doing it now." Heat touched her cheeks despite the cold. Lucien released her wrist without another word and leaned back again as though the exchange meant nothing. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere deep across the northern cliffs. Serafina stared toward the dark window beside her, trying to ignore the strange tension growing beneath her ribs every time he noticed something about her before she spoke it aloud. The carriage climbed higher into the mountains. Then suddenly the trees opened. Serafina leaned closer toward the glass instinctively. At first she saw only fog. Thick silver fog curling through the cliffs beneath weak moonlight struggling behind storm clouds. Then shapes slowly emerged from the darkness ahead. Towers, massive stone walls, iron spires cutting into the night sky. Her breath caught sharply. The estate rose from the mountain itself like some ancient fortress carved directly from black rock. Not elegant, not delicate. Nothing about it resembled the warm southern manners she had known growing up. This place looked built for war. Narrow windows glowed dim gold through the storm. Huge outer walls stretched across the cliffs connected by iron gates and watchtowers lit with flickering fire lanterns. Snow covered the rooftops in thick white layers while banners snapped violently in the wind high above the stone battlements. Serafina stared speechlessly. "This is your home?" Lucien turned his head slightly toward her. "Does it disappoint you?" "It terrifies me." That faint, almost smile returned briefly. "Honest answer." The carriage approached the outer gates slowly. Men carrying rifles stood guard beneath torchlight along the walls above them. The moment the carriage appeared, bells rang somewhere inside the fortress. Deep, heavy, ancient-sounding. The iron gates groaned open immediately. Serafina watched soldiers straighten sharply as the carriage passed beneath the archway. Every single one lowered his head toward Lucien's window. Not curiosity, recognition, respect, fear. "You still have not explained who you really are," she said softly. Lucien rested one gloved hand atop his cane again. "Not yet." The carriage entered the main courtyard. Snow swirled across massive black stone walls surrounding them on all sides. Servants hurried through the storm carrying lanterns and crates while stable hands rushed forward toward the horses. Everything moved with military precision. No wasted motion. No loud conversation. The moment the carriage stopped completely, for servants appeared at once beside the doors. Serafina noticed something strange immediately. Nobody looked directly at Lucien for longer than a second. They acknowledged him carefully, respectfully, then lowered their eyes again. One older servant stepped forward wearing a dark silver-trimmed coat. "Welcome home, sir." Lucien stepped down from the carriage without assistance. Snow crunched beneath his boots. "Any problems while I was gone?" "No major concerns." The servant hesitated slightly. "The East Patrol reported movement near the lower ridge yesterday." "Cromir?" "Possibly." Lucien nodded once. "Double the watch rotation tonight." "Yes, sir." Again. No hesitation. No questioning. Orders followed instantly. Serafina stepped carefully from the carriage next. Freezing wind tore through her thin wedding coat immediately. Before she could steady herself against the ice, Lucien's hand appeared beside her again. She accepted it automatically this time. His grip remained warm despite the storm. Strong too. Nothing about him felt uncertain or weak. The older servant looked toward her politely. "Welcome to Mordain Hall, ma'am." Mordain Hall. The name settled heavily in her chest. Lucien released her hand slowly. "This is Mrs. Wren," he said. "She manages the estate." Mrs. Wren bowed her head respectfully. Gray-haired, severe posture, intelligent eyes sharp enough to miss nothing. "Your rooms are prepared." Serafina frowned slightly. "Rooms?" Mrs. Wren's expression remained perfectly neutral. "His lordship maintains separate chambers." Something unreadable flickered across Lucien's face before disappearing instantly. "Show her the West Wing," he said quietly, "and have food sent immediately." Mrs. Wren inclined her head. "Of course." Lucien turned toward Serafina then. Snow gathered lightly across the shoulders of his black coat while torchlight flickered against the scar along his jaw. "You should rest. And you? I have work." Of course he did. Men like Lucien probably carried entire storms around inside them. Before she could answer, another man crossed the courtyard quickly toward them. Tall, military bearing, dark blonde hair dusted with snow. He stopped 3 feet from Lucien and lowered his voice immediately. "The council has been waiting since sunset." Lucien's expression hardened slightly. "They can continue waiting." The man's eyes shifted briefly toward Serafina. Curiosity flickered there before disappearing beneath discipline. "Understood." Lucien turned toward Serafina again. "This is Gideon Mercer." Gideon nodded politely. "Ma'am." But Serafina noticed it instantly. Gideon Mercer looked at Lucien the way soldiers looked at commanders. Not employers. Commanders. The realization tightened something cold inside her chest. Lucien inclined his head slightly toward Mrs. Wren. "Take her inside." Then he disappeared across the courtyard with Gideon beside him while snow swirled violently through torchlight behind them. Serafina watched him go longer than she intended. "This way, ma'am," Mrs. Wren said carefully. Serafina followed her toward the enormous entrance doors. The moment they opened, warmth flooded over her in waves carrying scents of cedarwood, smoke, and old stone. The entrance hall beyond stole her breath instantly. Massive vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow overhead. Dark marble floors reflected firelight from enormous chandeliers hanging above the central staircase. Portraits lined the walls between towering bookshelves and carved iron sconces. Yet despite the beauty, something about the manor felt strangely cold. Not temperature, memory. The house carried silence differently than normal homes did. Like grief had lived here too long. Servants moved quietly through the halls dressed in dark gray uniforms trimmed with silver thread. Each one stopped immediately upon seeing Serafina. Not openly rude. Not welcoming either. Curious. Careful. Measuring. Mrs. Wren guided her through endless corridors lined with black wood paneling and antique paintings lit by low amber lamps. "How large is this estate?" Serafina asked quietly. "The main structure has 4 wings," Mrs. Wren replied. "The northern grounds extend approximately 18 miles. 18 miles. Serafina almost stopped walking. "That is not an estate. That is a kingdom." Mrs. Wren's mouth nearly smiled. Nearly. Some people might agree. They passed another corridor lined with portraits. Serafina slowed slightly this time. Every painting depicted members of the same family across generations. Dark clothing, pale eyes, severe expressions. Mordane blood, she assumed. But something strange caught her attention immediately. Every portrait had damaged eyes. Some scratched, some painted over, others cut directly through the canvas itself. She stopped walking completely. What happened to these? Mrs. Wren's expression closed instantly. Old damage. All of them. Yes. Serafina stepped closer toward one portrait showing a dark-haired young man standing beside a frozen river. The entire upper half of the painting remained untouched except for the eyes. Violently scratched away. A chill moved through her. Who would do this? Mrs. Wren answered too quickly. Servants gossip about meaningless things in old houses. That was not an answer. It is the only one I have permission to give. Permission. Another careful sentence. Another hidden warning wrapped in politeness. Serafina looked back toward the damaged portraits again. Every single pair of eyes erased. Deliberately, methodically, the realization unsettled her deeply. Mrs. Wren resumed walking. "Your rooms are this way." Serafina followed slowly while questions multiplied behind her ribs faster than she could control them. Mordane Hall felt less like a home and more like a fortress protecting secrets nobody dared speak aloud. They finally reached the West Wing after climbing 2 grand staircases and crossing another endless corridor overlooking snow-covered cliffs through towering windows. Mrs. Wren opened a pair of dark oak doors at the hall's end. Warm golden light spilled outward instantly. Serafina stepped inside slowly. Her breath caught. The room was enormous. A fire crackled inside a marble hearth beneath carved bookshelves lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. Heavy velvet curtains framed towering windows overlooking the mountains below. A four-poster bed draped in dark silver fabric stood near the far wall beside polished black furniture and fresh flowers resting in crystal vases. Fresh flowers. In winter, everything looked impossibly luxurious compared to the life she left behind that morning. Yet the beauty only made her more uneasy somehow. "This was prepared very quickly," she said carefully. Mrs. Wren adjusted the cuffs of her sleeves once. "His lordship plans ahead." Again that title nearly slipped. His lordship. Not blind beggar. Not traveler. Something far more dangerous. A knock sounded softly behind them. Two maids entered carrying trays of food and warm tea. Both women kept their eyes lowered completely while arranging dishes beside the fire. Serafina noticed one maid glance nervously toward the hallway before whispering to the other under her breath. "Did he really bring her himself?" "Quiet!" the second maid hissed immediately. Mrs. Wren's voice cut through the room like cold steel. "Leave us!" Both maids nearly jumped before rushing out without another word. Silence returned instantly. Serafina turned toward Mrs. Wren slowly. "What exactly have I married into?" Mrs. Wren met her eyes fully for the first time. There was pity there. Real pity. Something the rest of the country fears very deeply. Before Serafina could speak again, distant bells rang somewhere below the manor. Heavy. Urgent. Mrs. Wren's expression tightened immediately. "Stay inside your chambers tonight," she said quietly. "Lock the doors after midnight." Cold moved through Serafina's stomach. "Why?" Mrs. Wren hesitated. Just briefly. "Because when Mordain Hall becomes restless, wise people avoid the corridors." Then she bowed slightly and left the room, closing the doors behind her with a heavy click that echoed through the enormous chamber. Serafina stood motionless beside the fire, listening to the storm howl against the cliffs outside. Then slowly, almost against her will, her gaze drifted back toward the hallway beyond the half-open doors, toward the distant corridor lined with portraits whose eyes had all been carved away. The storm did not quiet after midnight. If anything, the wind grew louder against the cliffs surrounding Mordain Hall, clawing at the windows with long mournful sounds that reminded Serafina of something alive trying to get inside. She sat alone beside the fire, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket from the wardrobe, staring at the untouched food cooling slowly on the silver trays nearby. Her body ached with exhaustion. Her mind refused sleep anyway. Too many questions crowded the silence. Too many contradictions walked these halls wearing Lucien Mordain's face. She glanced again toward the chamber doors, locked now exactly as Mrs. Wren instructed. Yet the warning still lingered beneath her skin. "Stay inside your chambers tonight. Wise people avoid the corridors." Serafina tightened the blanket around herself and looked toward the fire instead. Flames cracked softly against blackened logs. Outside, snow buried the northern mountains inch by inch beneath darkness. She wondered briefly whether Aunt Beatrice had slept peacefully after the wedding. Somehow she doubted it. Women like Beatrice only relaxed after danger fully disappeared. And Lucien Mordain did not feel like danger that disappeared quietly. He felt like danger waiting patiently. A soft sound interrupted her thoughts. Footsteps, very faint beyond the chamber doors. Serafina straightened immediately. Another sound followed. Not hurried footsteps, measured ones. Calm, slow, crossing the corridor outside her room. She held her breath instinctively. The footsteps stopped. Silence settled heavily against the door for 3 long seconds, then continued again farther down the hallway. Serafina exhaled slowly. Rational explanation, she told herself. Servants, guards, a large estate settling into night. Yet something still felt wrong. She stood carefully and crossed toward the windows overlooking the cliffs below. Snow blurred the world beyond the glass into silver shadows and black stone towers. Far beneath her, torchlights moved slowly along the outer walls where armed patrols continued walking despite the storm. An entire fortress awake through the night, waiting for something, or someone. Another sound drifted faintly through the room, this time from the hallway again. Voices. Serafina moved closer toward the doors without thinking. She should not listen. She knew that. But survival had taught her early that overheard truths often mattered more than spoken ones. She pressed lightly against the wood. Two voices. Men. One low and familiar. Lucian. The second belonged to Gideon Mercer. The eastern routes are sealed, Gideon said quietly beyond the door. Crowmer's men searched Black Hollow again before dusk. Any losses? Lucian asked. No, a pause followed. But they are getting desperate. Serafina leaned closer unconsciously. Desperate men become careless, Lucian said calmly. That usually improves my odds. You are taking unnecessary risks now. Silence. Then Gideon lowered his voice further. Bringing her here changed things. Serafina's pulse quickened instantly. I am aware. Lucian sounded colder now. Sharper somehow. The council will not remain silent much longer. The council does not control me. No, Gideon admitted quietly. But the kingdom still remembers what happened last winter. Silence again. Heavy silence this time. Serafina strained harder against the door. I do not need reminders, Lucian said finally. Very calm. Very dangerous. Gideon exhaled slowly. Then tell me honestly. Why her? Serafina's breath caught. Long silence answered him. So long she thought Lucian might refuse entirely. Then his voice came low enough that she barely heard it through the wood. Because Cromir wanted her. Footsteps moved again afterward, retreating farther down the corridor until silence returned completely. Serafina stepped away from the door slowly, heart beating harder than before, because Cromir wanted her. Not because Lucian needed a wife. Not because of kindness. Something else entirely. Something strategic. Cold unease settled beneath her ribs. She crossed back toward the fire and sat again carefully. Yet another thought troubled her more than the rest. Lucian never once sounded uncertain. Not with Gideon. Not with servants. Not with armed guards. Everyone around him moved like planets around gravity they could not escape. That was not ordinary authority. It was the kind built through fear, loyalty, and long survival. Sometime after 1 in the morning, exhaustion finally dragged her toward sleep. She lay carefully atop the massive bed, still wearing part of her wedding clothes beneath the blankets. The fire burned lower beside her. Snow hissed softly against the windows. Mordain Hall creaked around her like some enormous living creature settling into darkness. Then a sound woke her again. A sharp metallic click somewhere beyond the room. Serafina's eyes opened instantly. Darkness. The fire had burned nearly dead. Pale moonlight filtered weakly through storm clouds outside. She sat upright slowly, listening. Another click. Faint. Deliberate. From the hallway. Her pulse quickened. Rational thought told her to remain inside the room exactly as instructed. Curiosity rose stronger anyway. She slipped carefully from the bed and crossed toward the chamber doors barefoot against cold marble floors. The hallway beyond looked empty at first. Long stretches of darkness broken by dim wall lanterns flickering gold against black wood paneling. Silent. Still. Then movement. Farther down the corridor. A figure disappearing around the corner carrying a lantern low beside one leg. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Walking with absolute certainty despite the darkness. Lucian. Serafina froze. He moved too smoothly again. No hesitation. No reaching for walls. No tapping cane against floors. In fact, he carried no cane at all tonight. She watched him disappear completely around the far corner. Every instinct warned her not to follow. Every instinct failed. She wrapped her robe tighter around herself and stepped silently into the hallway. The floor beneath her feet remained cold enough to sting. She moved slowly past portraits whose damaged eyes seemed almost alive beneath the flickering lantern light. Every shadow inside Mordain Hall felt heavier at night. The deeper she walked into the corridor, the quieter the estate became until she could hear only distant wind outside and her own breathing. Then another sound emerged faintly ahead. A door opening. Serafina rounded the corner carefully. The hallway beyond stretched darker and narrower than the others with old portraits lining both walls. At the far end, weak light spilled through a partially open door. She approached silently. Voices drifted through the gap. Lucian's voice first. Calm. Controlled. You should have left the north weeks ago. Another voice answered. Male. Older. Nervous. I could not travel safely. You could have tried harder. Serafina moved closer without realizing it. The room beyond appeared to be a private study lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves and maps spread across a massive oak table. Lucian stood beside the fire reading papers beneath the lantern glow. Reading. Not pretending. Reading clearly with his own eyes. Serafina stopped breathing. He held an unfolded letter in one hand while scanning its contents calmly. No clouded uncertainty. No blindness. Nothing. Her entire body went cold. The older man standing opposite him lowered his voice anxiously. Cromir already suspects the border routes. Lucian set the letter down. Cromir suspects everything. It is one of his more exhausting qualities. And the girl. The older man glanced nervously toward the doorway. Does she know? Lucian's face revealed nothing. Not enough. Serafina stepped backward instinctively. Her bare foot brushed against the hallway runner. Soft sound. Tiny sound. Yet Lucian's head snapped toward the doorway instantly. Silver eyes locked directly onto the darkness where she stood hidden. This time there was no blindness in them at all. Only sharp, terrifying awareness. Silence crashed through the room. The older man turned quickly. Serafina's pulse exploded against her ribs. For one frozen second, nobody moved. Then Lucian spoke quietly into the silence. You should not walk through Mordain Hall after midnight. Her breath caught painfully. He knew. Of course he knew. Slowly, almost mechanically, Serafina stepped into the doorway light. Lucian stood motionless beside the fire, watching her openly now. No clouded gaze. No uncertainty. His eyes tracked every movement precisely. The truth hit harder than anger. He had never been blind. Not for 1 second. The older man immediately looked horrified. My lord, I did not realize. Lucian lifted one hand slightly. The man fell silent at once. Serafina stared at Lucian, unable to stop. You lied to me. His expression remained unreadable. Yes. No denial. No excuse. Somehow that hurt worse. Why? Lucian studied her quietly across the firelit room. Because men speak more freely around weakness. Blindness is not weakness. Something flickered briefly behind his eyes then. Respect maybe. Gone too quickly to trust. No, he admitted softly. But people believe it is. Serafina's chest tightened painfully. My family sold me to a lie. Your family sold you long before they met me. The brutal honesty landed sharply between them. Lucian stepped closer then. Firelight moved across the scar along his jaw while shadows deepened the hard lines of his face. Without the false blindness softening him, he looked even more dangerous than before. More powerful too. His gaze held hers completely now. Impossible to mistake. Impossible to escape. You should go back to your chambers, he said quietly. Serafina shook her head once. Who are you? Silence stretched. Wind screamed faintly against the distant towers outside. Finally Lucian answered. A man your enemies fear enough to hunt through mountains. That is not an answer. It is the only safe one tonight. Serafina's anger flared hotter suddenly. Do not speak to me like I am a child. The older man near the desk looked horrified again. Nobody else in Mordain Hall probably spoke to Lucian that way and survived the mistake comfortably. But Lucian only watched her for another long second before answering quietly. Then stop walking into dangerous rooms barefoot. Heat rushed unexpectedly into her face. She looked down automatically. Bare feet against cold stone. Thin robe barely protecting against the northern chill. Humiliating. Lucian removed his coat without another word and stepped closer. Before she could protest, he draped the heavy black wool carefully around her shoulders. Warmth surrounded her, instantly carrying traces of cedarwood, smoke, and winter air. Serafina froze. His fingers brushed lightly against the edge of her sleeve, then stopped, directly over the fading bruise hidden beneath the fabric. His gaze lowered briefly toward it. Something cold entered his expression. Not anger exactly. Worse, control holding anger still. When he spoke again, his voice had softened dangerously. Some truths keep people alive, Serafina. She looked up at him uncertainly. Lucian's eyes held hers steadily now without pretending blindness anymore. And some truths, he said quietly, get people killed. Serafina did not remember walking back to her chambers. One moment she stood in Lucian's hidden study wrapped in his coat while truths cracked open around her like ice beneath thin footsteps. The next she sat alone beside the dying fire in the west wing with her pulse still racing hard enough to hurt. Snow continued falling beyond the windows. Mordain Hall groaned softly around her like something ancient shifting in its sleep. But none of it felt as unsettling as the memory of Lucian's eyes following her perfectly through the darkness. Not blind. Never blind. She stared down at the black wool coat still wrapped around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of cedarwood and cold mountain air. Warm. Heavy. Dangerous in the same quiet way he was. Some truths keep people alive. And some truths get people killed. The words would not leave her alone. By morning, the storm had buried the northern cliffs beneath nearly 2 feet of snow. Weak gray sunlight filtered through thick clouds as servants moved silently through the hallways outside her chambers. Serafina had barely slept. Every time exhaustion pulled her under, she saw Lucian standing beside that fire watching her with clear silver eyes he had hidden from the world. Mrs. Wren arrived shortly after 8 carrying fresh clothes and breakfast trays. "You should eat," she said quietly while arranging tea beside the fire. Serafina looked toward her carefully. "Did you know?" Mrs. Wren's hands paused briefly over the silver tray. "Know what?" "That your master can see perfectly well." Silence settled instantly between them. Mrs. Wren resumed pouring tea without lifting her eyes. "Mordain Hall survives because people here understand when silence is necessary. That is not an answer. It is the safest one." Serafina stood slowly near the windows overlooking the snow-covered cliffs. "Everyone here lies for him." Mrs. Wren finally looked at her directly. No, her voice remained calm. "Everyone here survives because of him." Before Serafina could answer, another servant appeared quietly at the doorway. Young. Nervous. "The council has arrived, ma'am." Mrs. Wren's expression tightened slightly. "Already?" The servant nodded. 3 carriages. More guards outside. Serafina frowned. "What council?" Neither servant answered immediately. Mrs. Wren adjusted the cuffs of her sleeves once before speaking carefully. "Northern landowners. Political allies. Men who enjoy pretending they control things." "And Lucian?" Mrs. Wren's mouth nearly smiled again. "Nearly. He allows them the illusion occasionally." The servant hesitated near the doorway. "His lordship requested Lady Mordain join the midday gathering." Serafina froze slightly at the title. Lady Mordain. Real now. Permanent. Mrs. Wren dismissed the servant with a nod before turning back toward Serafina. "You should prepare carefully." "Why?" "Because every person arriving today already knows exactly who you are." Cold unease moved slowly through Serafina's stomach. "A poor girl sold to settle debts." "No," Mrs. Wren's gaze sharpened. "The woman Lucian Mordain brought into this house himself." That distinction clearly mattered here. Serafina simply did not understand why yet. The rest of the morning passed beneath heavy silence while maids prepared her for the gathering downstairs. Dark blue silk replaced the worn wedding dress from yesterday. Her hair was pinned carefully away from her face with silver combs matching the embroidery along her sleeves. The luxury still unsettled her. 3 days ago she could barely afford coal for heat. Now strangers dressed her like northern royalty. One young maid brushed powder lightly across Serafina's wrists and froze suddenly at the fading bruise beneath her skin. Fear flashed briefly across the girl's face before she looked away too quickly. Serafina noticed immediately. "What?" The maid swallowed hard. "Nothing, ma'am." "You reacted to the bruise." "No, ma'am." Another lie. Smaller than the others. But fear lived inside it all the same. Before Serafina could press further, Mrs. Wren returned. "They are waiting downstairs." The gathering took place inside a massive dining chamber overlooking the eastern cliffs. Long windows framed endless snow-covered mountains while silver chandeliers cast pale light across polished black wood and dark marble floors. Servants moved silently around an enormous table already crowded with northern aristocrats dressed in winter formal wear trimmed with fur and silver embroidery. Conversation stopped the instant Serafina entered. Every face turned toward her, measuring, curious, some openly disapproving. Lucian stood near the fireplace speaking quietly with Gideon Mercer when she arrived. He looked different in daylight somehow, sharper, more dangerous without the false helplessness masking him. His pale eyes lifted instantly toward her entrance. Not searching, seeing. The memory of last night tightened unexpectedly beneath her ribs. One older woman seated near the center of the table lowered her wine glass slowly. So this is the Southern bride. Her voice carried across the room with deliberate clarity. Lucian crossed toward Serafina before anyone else spoke. "You are late," he said calmly. "I was not informed this gathering required military punctuality." One corner of his mouth shifted slightly. Tiny amusement. Gone quickly. Yet Gideon noticed it immediately beside the fireplace and looked almost startled by the expression. Lucian offered Serafina his arm. "Come." She accepted, reluctantly aware every eye in the room followed the movement. The older woman watched openly now. Elegant. Severe. Probably 60. The kind of aristocrat who wore judgment better than jewelry. "You married quickly," she remarked toward Lucian. "Desperation encourages efficiency." Lucian's voice remained smooth. "Does that offend you, Lady Evermere?" "Not at all." The woman's gaze drifted toward Serafina. "I simply expected someone more politically useful." Silence hit the table instantly. Several nobles looked uncomfortable. Gideon sighed softly beneath his breath near the fireplace. Serafina straightened automatically. Years of humiliation had taught her exactly when people expected shame. Lucian pulled out the chair beside him slowly before answering. "How unfortunate for your expectations." Lady Evermere's expression cooled slightly. "I did not realize honesty became unwelcome at Mordain Hall." Lucian rested one hand against the back of Serafina's chair. Calm. Controlled. Dangerous beneath the surface in ways the entire room seemed to understand instinctively. "Honesty remains welcome," he said quietly. "Cruelty simply becomes tedious after breakfast." Absolute silence followed. Lady Evermere looked away first. Servants resumed moving carefully around the table. Conversation restarted in lower, quieter voices. Serafina stared at Lucian uncertainly while sitting beside him. He had defended her effortlessly, casually even. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Somehow that affected her more deeply than anger would have. Lucian sat beside her without another word and reached for the silver coffee service near the center of the table. Again no blindness. No hesitation. Every movement exact. Across from them, a heavy-set man with sharp eyes studied Serafina openly. "You came from Valewood territory, yes?" "Yes. Difficult region lately." He cut into his breakfast slowly. "Cromere acquisitions nearly doubled there before winter." Lucian's gaze lifted toward him immediately. "Careful, Rothwell." The warning beneath the calm voice settled heavily across the table. Lord Rothwell leaned back slightly. "Simple observation." No, Lucian stirred his coffee once. "You were attempting intimidation before noon. It lacks imagination." Serafina watched the exchange carefully. Nobody challenged Lucian twice. Not one person. Even the older nobles carried themselves cautiously around him despite obvious wealth and power of their own. That realization frightened her more with every passing hour. Conversation shifted gradually toward trade routes, border security, and winter shortages across northern territories. Serafina listened quietly while servants replaced dishes and fresh tea. She noticed something else then. Every political question eventually turned toward Lucian. Every final decision waited for his answer, whether openly acknowledged or not. The entire room revolved around him despite occasional resistance. Like planets forced unwillingly around gravity too powerful to escape. Halfway through the meal, another servant entered quickly through the eastern doors carrying a sealed letter. He crossed directly toward Lucian and lowered his head. "Urgent message from Black Hollow." Lucian accepted the letter one-handed while continuing his conversation without pause. Then he opened the seal immediately and scanned the page. scanned it, clearly, openly. Several nobles noticed at once. One younger lord blinked sharply toward the paper in Lucien's hand before looking away too fast. Serafina caught the reaction instantly. So did Lucien. Calmly he folded the letter closed and set it beside his untouched coffee. "Excuse me," he said quietly. Then he stood and crossed toward the windows overlooking the cliffs. Gideon followed immediately. The room erupted into softer conversation the moment Lucien moved farther away. Lady Evermere leaned slightly toward Serafina. "You seem surprised by him." Serafina chose her words carefully. "Should I not be? Most women are too frightened to remain observant." The older woman lifted her wine glass slowly. "That may become useful to you." "Useful for what?" Lady Evermere studied her for a long moment. "Survival." Cold settled beneath Serafina's ribs again. Across the room, Gideon spoke urgently beside the windows while Lucien listened in complete stillness. Then something strange happened. A servant carrying fresh dishes stumbled accidentally near the fireplace. One silver tray crashed sharply against marble floors. The entire room flinched. Lucien turned instantly toward the sound. Not surprising. What unsettled Serafina was the servant's reaction. The young man went pale as death before dropping immediately to one knee. "Forgive me, my lord." Absolute silence followed. Lucien crossed the room slowly toward the terrified servant. Everyone watched carefully, waiting. The servant's hands visibly shook against the marble floor. Lucien stopped beside him. "Stand up." The young man obeyed instantly. Lucien glanced once toward the broken silver scattered across the floor. "Did you cut yourself?" The servant blinked in confusion. "No, my lord." "Then clean it up and stop trembling." Relief flooded the servant's face so intensely it almost hurt to witness. He hurried to gather the broken pieces with shaking hands while conversation resumed cautiously around the table. Serafina stared after Lucien as he returned calmly to his seat beside her. "They are terrified of disappointing you." Lucien lifted his coffee cup without looking at her. "Disappointment is survivable." That was not reassurance. It was not meant to be. Before she could answer, the eastern doors opened again. This time colder air swept into the dining hall carrying traces of snow and horse leather. A tall man entered wearing an expensive charcoal coat dusted with winter frost. Dark hair streaked lightly with gray. Sharp, intelligent eyes. The atmosphere changed instantly. Several nobles looked visibly uncomfortable. Lord Rothwell muttered something beneath his breath. Lucien's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Cromir," Gideon said quietly near the windows. Edmund Cromir smiled as though entering among old friends rather than enemies. "I hope I am not interrupting." His gaze moved directly toward Serafina. Slow, assessing, possessive in a way that made her skin crawl. "Lady Mordain," he said smoothly. "What an unexpected pleasure." Lucien set down his coffee cup with perfect calm. "You entered my territory without invitation." Cromir's smile widened slightly. "And yet here I am." The room fell silent again. Snow hissed softly against the towering windows beyond the cliffs. Edmund Cromir crossed farther into the dining hall with absolute confidence despite every noble watching him carefully. Then his eyes settled fully on Serafina once more. "You look healthier already," he remarked casually. "Marriage clearly suits you." Something cold moved through Lucien beside her. Not visible anger. Worse, stillness. The kind before storms break mountains apart. Cromir finally turned toward him. "You should have negotiated with me properly instead of stealing property I intended to acquire." Property. Serafina's stomach twisted painfully. Lucien's voice dropped softer than before. Dangerously soft. "Be careful what language you use regarding my wife." The entire room went motionless. Cromir held Lucien's gaze another long second before smiling faintly again. "Of course." Yet the apology carried no apology at all. Then without warning, Lucien reached across the space between them and placed one gloved hand lightly against the back of Serafina's chair. Casual, possessive, protective enough that every noble in the room immediately noticed. Cromir noticed too, and for the first time since entering Mordain Hall, his smile disappeared completely. Edmund Cromier stayed for exactly 23 minutes after the tension settled across the dining hall like fresh snow before collapse. Long enough to poison the atmosphere. Long enough to remind every noble seated at that table that Mordain Hall was no longer isolated from whatever quiet war existed beyond the mountains. Seraphina remained silent through most of it. She watched instead. Cromier spoke politely. Too politely. The kind of politeness sharpened into a weapon through years of practice. He discussed border tariffs with Lord Rothwell while casually insulting 3 counties in the same breath. He complimented Lady Evermere's estate while implying her sons lacked discipline. And through every carefully measured conversation, his eyes returned to Seraphina again and again like unfinished business. Lucien noticed every single glance. He never reacted visibly. That somehow made the tension worse. The nobles around the table clearly understood the rules of this strange battlefield better than she did. Nobody interrupted Lucien directly. Nobody contradicted Cromier openly either. Instead, they navigated conversations the way travelers crossed frozen lakes. Carefully, listening for cracks beneath the surface. Finally, Cromier stood near the end of the meal and adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal gloves slowly. I should return south before the roads worsen. Nobody asked him to stay longer. Lucien remained seated beside Seraphina with one hand resting loosely near his untouched coffee cup. Safe travels, he said calmly. Cromier's smile returned slightly. You have always sounded so sincere while threatening people. Several nobles lowered their eyes immediately. Gideon Mercer stiffened near the windows. Lucien did not blink. You are still alive, Edmund. I would call that generosity. Silence hit the room hard enough to feel physical. Cromier studied him another long moment. Then he looked toward Seraphina. You should ask your husband sometime what happened at Blackmere Ridge. The name meant nothing to her. Yet the reaction around the room chilled her instantly. Lord Rothwell went pale. Lady Evermere tightened her grip on her wine glass. Gideon's expression hardened into something close to fury. Only Lucien remained perfectly still. Cromier inclined his head politely toward Seraphina one final time. You may discover the North worships monsters more easily than saints. Then he left. The dining hall remained silent long after the doors closed behind him. Snow drifted softly beyond the towering windows overlooking the cliffs. Somewhere outside, horses moved across frozen stone as Cromier's escort prepared to leave the fortress grounds. Seraphina slowly looked toward Lucien. What happened at Blackmere Ridge? Several nobles visibly froze. Gideon closed his eyes briefly like a man already exhausted. Lucien reached calmly for his coffee at last. You ask difficult questions very quickly, and you avoid answers professionally. A dangerous pause followed. Then, unexpectedly, Lady Evermere laughed softly beneath her breath. The sound startled nearly everyone at the table. Well, she murmured dryly, at least the girl has survival instincts. Lucien finally looked toward Seraphina fully. His silver eyes held hers steadily across the candlelight and winter shadows. Blackmere Ridge was a military campaign 8 years ago. Against whom? Traitors. One word. Flat. Final. Yet the room darkened somehow after he spoke it. Seraphina noticed the younger nobles exchanging uneasy glances. Nobody asked for more details. Nobody wanted them. The realization unsettled her deeply. Mrs. Wren entered quietly beside the doorway then and approached Lucien with careful urgency. The West Patrol returned early. Lucien stood immediately. Problems. One of the riders spotted movement near the lower pass. Gideon straightened near the windows. Cromier. Unknown. Lucien's expression hardened slightly. Double the gate watch tonight. Already done. He nodded once. Then his gaze shifted briefly toward Seraphina. You should remain inside the estate after sunset. Is that concern or another command? Something unreadable flickered briefly behind his eyes. Both. Then he left the dining hall with Gideon beside him while half the nobles watched in complete silence. The atmosphere changed the moment he disappeared. Conversation restarted slowly, more cautious than before. Lady Evermere sipped her wine thoughtfully across from Seraphina. You are adjusting surprisingly well. Seraphina looked toward the older woman carefully. Am I? Most Southern women would already be crying in one of the guest rooms. I finished crying years ago. Lady Evermere studied her for a long moment after that. Yes, she said quietly. I suspected as much. The afternoon passed beneath gray skies and worsening snow. Servants moved carefully through Mordain Hall, preparing for another storm front approaching from the northern ridges. Fires burned in nearly every corridor. Guards doubled along the outer walls. The entire estate carried the restless energy of people expecting trouble before nightfall. Serafina spent most of the afternoon exploring the safer wings of the manor under Mrs. Wren's supervision. The estate felt endless. Libraries, ballrooms, closed galleries filled with antique weapons and faded maps. Yet despite the luxury, certain parts of Mordain Hall remained strangely untouched. Entire corridors locked behind iron gates, staircases blocked by chains. One western tower permanently sealed according to the servants. Why? Serafina asked quietly while they passed another locked hallway guarded by two armed men. Mrs. Wren did not slow her pace. Structural instability. That answer sounded rehearsed. Because I have answered the question many times. And Mrs. Wren glanced toward the armed guards briefly before lowering her voice. People in this house survive longer when they stop asking why doors remain closed. Another warning disguised as advice. Serafina noticed that happened often here. Everything inside Mordain Hall felt layered beneath secrets too heavy to speak plainly. Later that evening, she found herself alone inside the Western Library, while snow buried the cliffs beyond the tall windows. The room smelled of old paper and cedar smoke. Thousands of books lined dark shelves stretching toward shadowed ceilings overhead. A fire crackled softly near leather chairs arranged beside a massive globe marked with trade routes and military territories. Serafina traced her fingers absently across one of the map tables. Northern borders, Black Hollow, East Ridge patrols. The names from earlier returned uneasily. Then another name surfaced in her memory. Blackmere Ridge. She moved toward the nearest bookshelf and began searching without entirely knowing why. History volumes filled one section near the fireplace. Military records occupied another. Finally she found it. A leather-bound archive detailing northern campaigns from the last decade. Her pulse quickened slightly as she opened the heavy cover. Pages crackled softly beneath her fingers. Border conflicts, political rebellions, winter sieges. Then suddenly the name appeared. The Blackmere Ridge Incident. Serafina scanned the faded print quickly. 8 years ago, Northern rebellion suppressed after a failed assassination attempt against the crown. Casualties severe. Final victory secured under command of Duke Lucien Mordain. She froze. Duke. The word stared back at her from the page like a blade sliding slowly between ribs. Not lord. Not wealthy recluse. Duke. Her pulse thundered painfully now. Lucien Mordain was not simply powerful. He was one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. The realization shifted everything instantly. The servants, the soldiers, the fear surrounding his name, even Crowmere's caution. It all made terrible sense now. Serafina turned another page with shaking fingers. Reports continued. Blackmere Ridge became infamous after enemy forces vanished overnight during the final campaign. Rumors spread afterward through northern territories. The Grey Duke, the Winter Commander, the man who ended wars without warning. A floorboard creaked softly behind her. Serafina spun around, instantly clutching the book tighter against her chest. Lucien stood near the library entrance, watching her quietly. No cane tonight. No false blindness. Just silver eyes sharp enough to strip truth bare from shadows. You left the military archives unlocked, she said carefully. Lucien crossed slowly toward the fire. Nothing inside them remains secret. Except your title, apparently. He removed his gloves one finger at a time beside the flames. That part was necessary. Necessary for whom? For survival. Serafina stared at him openly now. You are a duke. Yes. The simple honesty unsettled her more than another lie might have. You let my family believe you were a beggar. Your family believed whatever protected their debts. He stepped closer toward the map table. I simply did not correct them. That is manipulation. That is strategy. Silence stretched between them while snow battered the windows outside. Finally, Serafina looked down toward the history volume still clutched against her chest. The records say you commanded northern forces during the rebellion. I did. And Lucian's expression remained unreadable beside the firelight. And what? People here react to your name like they are remembering funerals. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There. Finally. A crack beneath the calm surface. War leaves unpleasant memories. What happened at Blackmere Ridge? Lucian looked toward the fire instead of answering immediately. Shadows moved across the scar along his jaw while silence gathered heavily around them. A king survived, he said quietly. Several traitors did not. That is still not an answer. No, his silver eyes lifted toward her again. It is the only version polite society prefers repeating. Serafina closed the history volume slowly. Cromere called you a monster. Lucian's expression did not change. Edmund Cromere profits from fear. He would call winter itself a monster if snow became inconvenient. And is he wrong? Another dangerous pause. Then Lucian surprised her completely. Sometimes. The honesty struck harder than denial. Serafina searched his face carefully beside the firelight. You do not defend yourself very often. No, why? Because people usually decide what they fear long before they meet it. Wind screamed sharply against the windows then. The fire shifted low gold across the library shelves. Serafina suddenly realized how isolated they were inside the enormous manor. Just the two of them surrounded by old wars and northern shadows. Lucian crossed toward her slowly. Not threatening. Somehow worse. Controlled. You should stop reading military archives before dinner, he said quietly. They encourage unpleasant conclusions. Like discovering I married one of the most feared men in the kingdom? His mouth moved slightly. That almost smile again. Faint. Tired this time. You noticed eventually. Serafina stared at him another long moment before speaking softly. Did you choose me because Cromere wanted me? Lucian's expression stilled completely. Silence answered first. Then finally, partly. Pain flickered unexpectedly beneath her ribs. Small. Sharp. She hated that it mattered. Lucian noticed the shift instantly, of course. He noticed everything. His gaze lowered briefly toward her hands gripping the heavy archive book too tightly. But not only because of that, he added quietly. Serafina looked up quickly. Then why? Lucian studied her in silence while snow drifted beyond the library windows and firelight moved gold across the old war maps surrounding them. For one strange second he looked almost tired. Not physically. Older than exhaustion somehow. Then the moment vanished. Because, he said softly, you looked at me during the wedding ceremony like you still believed monsters could choose not to become worse. Her breath caught unexpectedly. Before she could answer, sudden shouting erupted somewhere far below the library floor. Voices. Running footsteps. A bell rang sharply through the estate. Once. Twice. Urgent. Lucian's entire posture changed instantly. Calm vanished beneath something colder. Faster. He crossed toward the doorway immediately. Stay here. Serafina followed anyway. By the time they reached the upper balcony overlooking the central entrance hall below, servants and guards already flooded the corridors carrying rifles and lanterns. Snow blasted violently through partially opened entrance doors at the far end of the hall. Gideon Mercer appeared below them shouting orders toward armed patrols rushing outside. Seal the southern gate. Lucian descended the staircase rapidly. Serafina followed several steps behind despite every instinct warning her not to. Gideon looked up sharply the moment Lucian reached the lower hall. Rider from the East Patrol, he said quickly. Someone breached the lower pass. The atmosphere inside Mordain Hall shifted instantly into something dangerous and alive. Guards moved toward the entrances. Servants disappeared from hallways. Even the chandeliers seemed colder beneath the rising tension. Then suddenly one of the massive entrance doors slammed open beneath a blast of snow and freezing wind. A wounded rider stumbled inside supported by two guards. Blood darkened one sleeve beneath the lantern light. Serafina froze instinctively. The rider looked barely conscious. Gideon moved forward immediately. What happened? The rider struggled for breath against the storm cold. Ambush near the eastern ridge. His eyes lifted weakly toward Lucien. They knew the patrol route. Silence crashed through the hall. Lucien went completely still. Not shocked. Worse. Focused. Then the rider spoke one final sentence that turned the entire fortress colder. "And my lord," he rasped painfully. "They asked specifically for your wife." The entire entrance hall seemed to freeze around the rider's final words. Snow blew violently through the open doors behind him while guards tightened their grip on rifles and servants disappeared silently from the corridors above. Serafina stood halfway down the staircase, unable to move for one terrible second. "They asked specifically for your wife." Lucien remained perfectly still at the center of the hall beneath the chandelier light. Yet something changed in him instantly. Not anger, not panic. Something colder, more dangerous. Gideon Mercer noticed it too. His expression hardened immediately. "Seal every lower passage," he ordered toward the guards. "No patrol travels alone tonight." Men moved at once. Boots thundered across marble floors. Heavy doors slammed shut against the storm. The wounded rider nearly collapsed beside the entrance while another servant hurried forward with blankets and bandages. Through all of it, Lucien never looked away from the rider. "How many attackers?" he asked quietly. Could not see clearly through the snow. The rider struggled for breath. "At least 6. Maybe more. Uniforms? No markings." Lucien's silver eyes narrowed slightly. "Cromir hires cowards now." Gideon crossed closer. "You think this came from him?" No, Lucien's voice remained dangerously calm. "I know it did." Serafina watched him carefully from the staircase. Something about the way he stood unsettled her deeply. Every person in the hall moved around him with sharpened urgency now, like soldiers around a commander before battle. The realization struck her suddenly with painful clarity. This was not merely a duke protecting an estate. This was a man accustomed to war. Lucien finally turned toward her. Their eyes met across the cold marble hall. "Go back to the West Wing." The command hit instantly. Automatic. Controlled. Serafina descended another step instead. "They are looking for me." "Exactly. Then perhaps I deserve to know why." Several guards nearby glanced toward her nervously before quickly lowering their eyes again. Nobody spoke to Lucien like that when he wore this expression. Lucien crossed toward the staircase slowly. Snow and torchlight still moved behind him from the open entrance hall while servants rushed through corridors carrying supplies and messages. He stopped 3 steps below her, close enough now that she could see exhaustion hidden beneath his calm exterior for the first time. "Not tonight," he said quietly. "Tonight you stay alive." Before she could answer, a loud bell rang somewhere deep inside Mordain Hall. Once, twice, then 3 sharp strikes. Gideon swore softly under his breath near the doors. "Lower gate breach," he snapped. "Move." Guards flooded toward the southern corridors immediately. Lucien's attention shifted instantly toward the sound. Focused. Precise. Yet before he turned away completely, his hand closed briefly around Serafina's wrist. Not rough. Firm. His thumb brushed once against the fading bruise hidden beneath her sleeve. "Stay near Mrs. Wren," he said quietly. "Do not open any door yourself after dark." Then he released her and disappeared toward the lower halls with Gideon and 6 armed guards following behind him. Serafina stood frozen on the staircase long after he vanished. The fortress around her had transformed completely now. Mordain Hall no longer felt like an isolated aristocratic estate. It felt like a castle under siege. Mrs. Wren appeared beside her moments later, carrying none of the calm restraint she usually wore. "You need to return upstairs immediately." "What is happening?" "Trouble." "That is not an answer." Mrs. Wren lowered her voice sharply. "Ma'am, this house has survived because people obey quickly during nights like this." Nights like this, meaning there had been others. Serafina followed her reluctantly through the upper corridors while guards rushed past carrying rifles and lanterns toward the lower wings. Every servant inside Mordain Hall moved faster now. Fear had entered the estate openly. They reached the West Wing minutes later. Mrs. Wren locked the chamber doors personally before checking each window overlooking the cliffs. Snow hammered against the glass hard enough to blur the world outside into white darkness. "Has this happened before?" Serafina asked quietly. Mrs. Wren hesitated while adjusting the curtains. "Yes, often." Another pause. "Often enough." Serafina crossed toward the fire slowly. "Who exactly is Lucian at war with?" Mrs. Wren looked toward her carefully. "Men who mistake power for ownership. That sounds like Cromir." "Cromir is only one problem." The older woman moved closer toward the hearth and lowered her voice further. "Your husband has enemies because he keeps people alive who were supposed to disappear." Serafina frowned slightly. "I do not understand." "You are not meant to yet." Frustration flickered through Serafina's chest. "Everyone in this house speaks in riddles." Mrs. Wren surprised her then. Very softly, almost tiredly, she said, "Because direct truths buried too many people here already." Silence settled heavily after that. Outside, wind screamed against the towers, while distant footsteps echoed through lower corridors beneath the west wing. Serafina sat near the fire, wrapped once again in Lucian's heavy black coat. She had not returned it. She told herself that was only because the northern cold reached into her bones by sunset. Nothing more dangerous than that. Yet she noticed something unsettling all the same. The coat made her feel safer. The realization irritated her immediately. Lucien Mordain lied to her from the beginning. He manipulated her family. He hid his identity behind false blindness and silence. None of that should feel safe. And yet when danger entered the estate tonight, every instinct inside her searched for him first. The thought unsettled her enough that she stood abruptly and crossed toward the windows again. Snow buried the cliffs beyond Mordain Hall beneath endless darkness. Tiny lanterns moved far below where patrols crossed the outer walls. Somewhere in that storm Lucien and his men searched for enemies already close enough to threaten the fortress itself. "You care for him already." Serafina turned sharply. Mrs. Wren stood beside the bookshelf quietly watching her. "That is absurd." "Is it? I barely know him." Sometimes fear creates honesty faster than affection. Serafina looked away toward the storm again. "He lies too easily." Mrs. Wren's expression softened unexpectedly. Lucien learned long ago that honesty makes vulnerable people easier to bury. Before Serafina could answer, another knock sounded sharply against the chamber doors. Both women stiffened instantly. Mrs. Wren moved toward the entrance immediately. "Who is it?" "Gideon." The answer came quickly from the hallway. Mrs. Wren unlocked the doors carefully while one hand remained hidden beneath her sleeve near a small silver pistol Serafina had not noticed earlier. Gideon Mercer entered carrying Snow across the shoulders of his dark coat. His expression looked grim. "The lower pass is secure for now." "Casualties?" Mrs. Wren asked quietly. "Minor injuries." Gideon's eyes shifted toward Serafina. "But someone inside the estate leaked patrol routes." Cold spread slowly through Serafina's stomach. "A traitor." Gideon nodded once. "Possibly more than one." Mrs. Wren closed the chamber doors immediately behind him. "Does Lucien know?" Gideon nearly smiled at the question. "Lucien usually knows things before the rest of us realize they matter." He crossed toward the fire and lowered his voice. "Cromir has been trying to reach this estate for years. Tonight felt different." "How?" Serafina asked quietly. Gideon studied her carefully before answering. "Because they stopped hiding what they wanted." Silence followed. Serafina wrapped Lucien's coat tighter around herself unconsciously. Gideon noticed. So did Mrs. Wren. Neither commented. Finally Serafina asked the question haunting her since the rider entered the hall. "Why would Cromir care about me?" Gideon exchanged one quick glance with Mrs. Wren. There. Another secret. Another silence. "Because you belong to Lucien now," Gideon answered carefully. "That cannot be the only reason." "No," Gideon's expression darkened slightly. "But it is the safest answer." Serafina almost laughed bitterly. "Everyone in this house protects me with half-truths." Gideon's voice lowered further. "No, Lady Mordain. We protect you because men outside these walls would use truth to destroy you." Before she could press harder, Another sound cut sharply through the room. Glass shattering somewhere down the corridor. Mrs. Wren moved instantly. Gideon already had a pistol drawn before the echo faded completely. "Stay behind me," he ordered sharply. Seraphina's pulse exploded against her ribs. More sounds followed. Running footsteps. A servant shouting somewhere nearby. Then sudden silence again. The worst kind. Gideon crossed toward the chamber doors slowly, while Mrs. Wren extinguished 2 lamps near the windows in quick practiced movements. Darkness swallowed half the room instantly. "What is happening?" Seraphina whispered. "Quiet," Gideon muttered. He opened the chamber doors carefully. The hallway beyond looked nearly black except for weak lantern light flickering farther down the corridor. One overturned table lay near the staircase. Broken glass glittered across the floorboards. No servants. No guards. Just silence. Gideon stepped into the hallway first with pistol raised. Mrs. Wren followed carrying the silver weapon from her sleeve now openly in hand. Seraphina stayed near the doorway despite every instinct screaming at her to retreat. Then she heard it. Breathing. Not theirs. Somewhere farther down the corridor. Gideon heard it too. His entire posture sharpened instantly. "Show yourself," he said coldly into the darkness. No answer. Only wind moaning faintly through distant towers. Then movement. A shadow darted briefly near the far staircase. Gideon lunged forward immediately. Mrs. Wren grabbed Seraphina's arm hard enough to bruise. Inside now. But before either woman moved, another figure emerged suddenly from the darkness farther down the corridor. Tall, broad-shouldered, black coat dusted with snow. Lucien. Relief hit Seraphina so fast it almost hurt. Lucien crossed toward them quickly while Gideon lowered the pistol with visible frustration. "We lost him," Gideon muttered. Lucien barely acknowledged the words. His silver eyes locked directly onto Seraphina first. Checking. Confirming. Safe. Only then did the dangerous tension ease slightly from his shoulders. "Was anyone hurt?" he asked quietly. "No," Mrs. Wren answered. But someone reached the west wing. Lucien's jaw tightened subtly. He looked toward the shattered glass near the staircase. Then toward the dark corridor beyond it. Something cold entered his expression. "Increase guards on every upper entrance." Gideon nodded immediately and disappeared back down the hall. Lucien remained where he was another long second watching the darkness beyond the broken staircase. Then finally his attention returned toward Seraphina. She realized suddenly how close he stood now. Snow melted slowly across the shoulders of his black coat. One gloved hand still rested near the pistol holstered beneath the fabric. Yet despite the danger surrounding him, his voice softened slightly when he spoke to her. "Did they frighten you?" Seraphina almost answered automatically, then stopped, because the truth felt dangerous too. "No," she said quietly. "Not as much as the thought of what you would have done if they reached me first." Silence stretched between them. Mrs. Wren lowered her eyes instantly and moved quietly toward the far side of the room, giving them privacy without permission ever being spoken aloud. Lucien watched Seraphina another long moment beside the flickering firelight and shattered hallway shadows. Then something unexpected crossed his face. Not anger, not coldness, something far more human. Tired concern. "That," he said softly, "is probably the smartest thing you have said since arriving here." Before she could answer, a sudden sharp crack echoed from somewhere outside the fortress walls. Gunfire. The sound rolled across the mountains beneath the storm. Every muscle in Lucien's body tightened instantly. Then another shot followed. Closer this time. Much closer. And from somewhere below the west wing, a guard shouted the words that turned the entire corridor cold. They breached the inner wall. The second gunshot echoed across the cliffs like thunder breaking stone apart. Mordain Hall exploded into motion instantly. Bells rang through the fortress corridors while guards stormed down staircases carrying rifles and lanterns. Somewhere below the west wing, men shouted orders against the storm. Seraphina stood frozen beside the shattered hallway window while snow blew violently through the broken glass. Lucien moved first. Of course he did. He crossed toward the staircase immediately with terrifying calm, every movement sharp with controlled purpose. Not panic. Never panic. Gideon appeared again from the lower corridor at nearly the same moment. 3 men breached the inner wall, he said quickly. 1 already reached the armory entrance. Lucien's silver eyes hardened into something lethal. Cromir grows impatient. This no longer feels like intimidation. No, Lucien reached beneath his coat and removed a second pistol Serafina had not realized he carried. It feels personal. Another gunshot cracked somewhere beneath the western towers. Mrs. Wren flinched slightly beside the chamber doors. Lucien turned toward Serafina then. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly the moment he looked at her. The coldness remained. Yet beneath it lived something more dangerous now. Concern. "You stay here," he said quietly. "With respect," Serafina answered instantly. "That plan has already failed twice tonight." Gideon looked between them carefully. Mrs. Wren nearly closed her eyes. Nobody in Mordain Hall argued with Lucien during emergencies. Yet Serafina kept doing it with alarming consistency. Lucien stepped closer toward her. Snow melted slowly across the shoulders of his black coat while wine screamed through the broken hallway behind him. "This is not negotiable. And what happens when they reach this wing again? They will not. You cannot promise that." Silence stretched sharply between them. Lucien's jaw tightened once. There. The smallest fracture in his control. "No," he admitted quietly. "I cannot." The honesty landed harder than reassurance would have. Another crash echoed somewhere below the west staircase. Gideon cursed softly under his breath. "We are running out of time." Lucien's attention shifted instantly back toward the hallway. Then, unexpectedly, he reached for Serafina's hand. Warm fingers wrapped tightly around hers for one brief dangerous second. "Come with me." The words surprised everyone in the corridor. Gideon looked genuinely startled. Even Mrs. Wren blinked. Lucien ignored all of them. He was already moving. Serafina followed automatically through the western halls while guards rushed around them toward lower entrances. The fortress had transformed completely now. Smoke drifted faintly through upper corridors from extinguished lanterns. Servants hurried frightened nobles toward safer wings while armed men secured staircases and iron gates throughout the estate. Somewhere distant, another bell rang sharply through the storm. Lucien led Serafina through twisting hallways deeper inside Mordain Hall than she had yet seen. Not toward the main chambers. Downward. Into older parts of the fortress where torchlight replaced chandeliers and cold stone walls narrowed around them. Gideon followed close behind carrying 2 rifles now slung across his shoulders. "How many guards remain at the eastern wing?" Lucien asked without slowing. 8. "Not enough." "I know." Serafina glanced between them while struggling to keep pace down the steep stone stairs. "Where are we going?" "Below the main estate." Lucien's voice remained calm despite the chaos erupting above them. "There are safer rooms beneath the fortress." "You have underground rooms?" Gideon answered grimly this time. Mordain Hall was built during civil wars. Half the estate exists below ground. The deeper they descended, the colder the air became. Torches flickered along ancient stone walls lined with old iron reinforcements and faded military banners. This part of the fortress felt older than the upper manor. Older than elegance itself. Built for survival first, beauty second. They finally reached a massive iron door guarded by 4 armed men. The guards straightened instantly the moment Lucien approached. One opened the entrance without a word. Warmth spilled outward immediately. Serafina stepped inside and stopped short. The underground chamber looked enormous. Not dungeon-like as she expected. More like a hidden residence beneath the fortress. Maps covered the walls beside shelves of supplies, books, medical equipment, and weapons secured carefully behind iron cabinets. Several servants moved quickly through the room organizing blankets and lanterns while 2 older nobles from the dinner gathering sat near the fire looking pale with exhaustion. Lady Evermere glanced up the moment Serafina entered. "Well," she murmured dryly, "that explains the panic upstairs." Lucien released Serafina's hand slowly only after the iron doors sealed shut behind them. The heavy sound echoed through the underground chamber like final judgment. Gideon immediately crossed toward another group of armed men near the far wall. Quiet strategy discussions resumed at once around maps spread across a long oak table. Serafina looked toward Lucien carefully. You planned for attacks like this. He removed his gloves slowly beside the firelight. The North survives by expecting betrayal eventually. How often does your home come under siege? Less often than rumors suggest. Lady Evermere snorted softly from her chair near the fire. That is an extremely generous interpretation. Lucien ignored the comment completely. Instead, his attention returned toward Serafina again. Always toward her now. She noticed that increasingly. Even in rooms crowded with soldiers and nobles, some part of his awareness remained fixed on her safety first. The realization unsettled her more every hour. Mrs. Wren approached carrying a cup of tea wrapped in steam. Drink this. Serafina accepted automatically. Her hands had started shaking without permission sometime during the escape downstairs. She hated that anyone noticed. Lucien noticed immediately, of course. He always did. You should sit, he said quietly. I am fine. No, he answered calmly. You are pretending remarkably well. Heat touched her cheeks unexpectedly. Lady Evermere watched the exchange across the room with visible interest before hiding it carefully behind her wine glass. Serafina moved toward the fire mostly because her knees suddenly felt unreliable beneath the adrenaline still racing through her body. She sat carefully near one of the underground maps spread across the long oak table. Trade routes, mountain passes, patrol markers, entire sections marked with red ink and coded symbols she did not understand. Mordain Hall was not simply a northern estate. It operated like military headquarters. Lucien crossed toward Gideon moments later while lowering his voice enough that only fragments reached her through the chamber noise. Any sign of internal assistance? Almost certainly. Staff? Maybe. One guard missing after the breach. Lucien's expression darkened slightly. Find him. Serafina looked away before he noticed her listening again. Yet another truth revealed itself piece by piece beneath the surface of this fortress. Lucien did not merely command loyalty. He commanded fear sharp enough to hold entire territories together during violence. The underground chamber slowly filled with more displaced staff and nobles as the storm worsened overhead. Yet despite the chaos, people calmed noticeably whenever Lucien crossed the room. Not because he offered comfort, because his presence itself felt immovable. Like stone walls surviving winter after winter without apology. Hours passed beneath torchlight and restless silence. Reports arrived regularly through armed messengers entering from hidden lower tunnels connected to the estate above. One attack repelled near the east gate. Another failed attempt at the lower armory. Crowmere's men growing desperate as the night deepened. Serafina listened quietly from near the fire while exhaustion settled heavily through her body. At some point, Mrs. Wren draped another blanket around her shoulders. At another point, Lady Evermere fell asleep, sitting upright in her chair like exhausted royalty refusing vulnerability. Time blurred underground. Then, sometime after midnight, Serafina noticed Lucien alone near the far side of the chamber studying one of the large military maps beneath low lantern light. For the first time all evening, nobody surrounded him demanding orders or reports. He stood silent with one hand braced against the table edge while snowmelt dried slowly across his black coat. Tired. The sight startled her unexpectedly. Not weakness exactly. Weariness hidden too long. Before she fully decided to move, her feet carried her toward him anyway. Lucien noticed her approach instantly without looking up. You should rest. You have not rested either. Different responsibilities. Serafina stopped beside the map table. Up close, she noticed faint shadows beneath his eyes and another newer detail. A small cut near his wrist partially hidden beneath the sleeve of his coat. You are hurt. Lucien glanced down briefly. Barely. That was not denial. I am improving. Despite everything, a quiet laugh escaped her before she stopped it. Lucien looked toward her then. Really looked. The underground lantern light softened the dangerous sharpness of his face slightly, while shadows moved gold across the old scar along his jaw. There it is again, he murmured softly. What? The sound you only make when you forget to be afraid. Something tightened unexpectedly inside her chest. She looked down quickly toward the maps instead. I am still afraid. Of me? The question came quietly. Too quietly. Serafina hesitated. Honesty felt dangerous around him, yet somehow lying felt worse. Sometimes. Lucien accepted the answer with unsettling calm. Reasonable. That does not bother you? Fear keeps people alive in places like this. He rested one hand against the map table beside her. Close now. Close enough that she caught the scent of cedarwood and cold winter air again beneath the smoke and underground stone. What bothers me, he added more quietly, is that you keep walking toward danger anyway. Serafina looked up at him carefully. You say that like you are not standing in the center of it. Silence stretched between them. The chamber noise faded strangely around the edges. For one dangerous second, the rest of Mordain Hall seemed very far away. Lucien's silver eyes held her steadily beneath the lantern glow. Not cold now. Not blind. Just intensely aware of her in ways she still did not understand. Then suddenly the iron doors at the far end of the underground chamber burst open. A guard stumbled inside breathless from the storm tunnels above. My lord! Every conversation stopped instantly. Lucien turned immediately. Report. The western corridor is secure now. Relief flickered briefly across Gideon's face nearby. Then the guard continued. But we captured one of the attackers alive. The atmosphere shifted sharply again. Lucien's expression went completely still. And the guard swallowed once. He says he was not hired by Cromir. Silence crashed through the underground chamber. Gideon stepped forward immediately. Who sent him? The guard looked toward Serafina. Pale. Nervous. He claims, the man said carefully, that someone inside the royal court wants Lady Mordain removed before spring. Silence spread through the underground chamber so completely that even the fire seemed to quiet beneath it. Someone inside the royal court wants Lady Mordain removed before spring. The words settled heavily across the old stone room while nobles, guards, and servants stared toward the messenger with pale expressions. Serafina felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. Lucien did not move at all. That frightened her more than panic would have. He stood beside the war table with one hand resting near the maps while shadows flickered across his face beneath the lantern glow. Stillness wrapped around him like winter before collapse. Gideon Mercer crossed toward the messenger immediately. Who in the royal court? The guard swallowed hard. The prisoner does not know names. Convenient. He claims the orders came through intermediaries in the southern territories. Lady Evermere set down her wineglass carefully near the fire. Then this was never about Cromir alone. No, Lucien answered quietly. Every eye in the chamber shifted toward him instantly. His silver gaze remained fixed on the map table before him. Cromir was only useful because people already expected him. Serafina watched him carefully. Expected him for what? Lucien looked up slowly. To become reckless enough to hide larger problems. The truth landed like cold iron in her chest. She had spent days believing Edmund Cromir was the center of this danger. Now she realized he might only be one piece inside something much larger. Gideon exhaled sharply. If the royal court is involved, then someone informed them about the marriage almost immediately. Yes. Lucien's expression hardened further. Which means someone inside this fortress is still speaking. Mrs. Wren closed her eyes briefly beside the fire. Several nobles shifted uneasily in their chairs. Fear changed shape inside the underground chamber now. Before, they feared attackers beyond the walls. Now they feared betrayal beside them. Serafina wrapped Lucien's heavy coat tighter around herself unconsciously. The underground air suddenly felt colder despite the fires burning around them. Why would the royal court care about me? She asked quietly. No one answered immediately. That silence told her enough already. Lucien finally stepped away from the war table and crossed toward the firelight. Because the wrong people believe you matter to me. The honesty struck harder than comfort would have. Serafina stared at him, unable to speak for a second. Lady Evermere watched both of them carefully over the rim of her wineglass. You should have left her in the south, the older woman said quietly toward Lucien. Gideon looked immediately uncomfortable. Mrs. Wren stiffened near the bookshelves. Lucian's attention shifted toward Lady Evermere slowly. No, one word. Flat. Absolute. The older woman held his gaze another moment before sighing softly into her drink. Then heaven help whoever decided to threaten her. Silence returned. Not peaceful silence. Waiting silence. Lucian crossed back toward the strategy table and picked up one of the coded reports scattered across the maps. No one leaves Mordain Hall until morning, he ordered calmly. Double internal patrols. No servant moves between wings unescorted. Guards throughout the chamber immediately began carrying out orders without hesitation. Gideon approached Lucian more quietly this time. And the prisoner? Lucian scanned the report in his hand once before answering. Alive. The single word surprised several people in the room. Gideon included. You want him questioned further? Lucian finally looked toward Gideon directly. I want whoever sent him to become confident enough to make another mistake. Serafina watched the exchange carefully. Everything around Lucian operated on levels she still struggled to fully understand. He spoke softly, rarely raised his voice, yet entire rooms shifted direction the moment he made decisions. Power moved around him differently than around ordinary men. It moved like inevitability. Hours passed slowly underground while the storm continued raging above the fortress. Additional reports arrived through hidden lower tunnels connected to the outer patrol routes. The attacks eventually stopped near dawn. No more breaches. No more gunfire echoing through the mountains. Yet nobody relaxed completely. Too many questions remained unanswered. Serafina sat near the fire beside Lady Evermere sometime close to morning while servants distributed fresh tea and blankets throughout the underground chamber. Exhaustion pressed heavily behind her eyes now. She had not truly slept since arriving at Mordain Hall. Lady Evermere studied her quietly for several moments before speaking. You are handling this better than most aristocratic daughters would. Serafina managed a tired, almost smile. I am not aristocratic enough to faint dramatically. Unexpected amusement flickered briefly across the older woman's face. No, you are something much more dangerous. What does that mean? Lady Evermere looked toward Lucian across the chamber. He stood near Gideon again, reviewing patrol reports beneath the lantern glow. Even exhausted, people unconsciously cleared space around him. It means you still think kindness matters after suffering, she said softly. Men like Lucian noticed that. Serafina looked toward him too. I do not understand him at all. Neither does most of the kingdom. Lady Evermere lowered her voice slightly. That is why they fear him. Before Serafina could ask more, Gideon approached carrying another sealed document. His expression looked grim. Message from the capital. Lucian accepted the letter one-handed and broke the royal seal immediately. Serafina watched his face carefully while he read. For the first time since she met him, genuine anger flickered openly behind his eyes. Brief, sharp, gone almost instantly beneath control. Gideon noticed too. What happened? Lucian folded the letter slowly. The Queen requests our presence at court before the end of winter. The underground chamber went completely still again. Lady Evermere muttered something under her breath involving royal disasters and poor timing. Gideon looked openly concerned now. That is too fast. Yes. Lucian slipped the letter inside his coat. Which means she already knows more than she should. Serafina frowned. The Queen knows about me? Lucian's gaze settled briefly on her. The Queen knows everything eventually. Unease tightened through her chest. Why would she summon us? Because royal courts survive on curiosity and paranoia. That still does not answer the question. Lucian crossed toward the fire slowly. Tiredness shadowed his features more clearly now beneath the underground light. Because powerful men do not marry unknown women quietly, he said. Not without consequences. The truth landed painfully. Unknown woman. She knew he did not intend cruelty. That somehow made it worse. Lucian noticed the shift in her expression immediately. Of course he did. His gaze softened slightly. Serafina. No, she stood too quickly from the chair near the fire. You are correct. Everyone nearby fell silent instantly. She hated that too. Hated that entire rooms watched every exchange between them now like political weather. I was a desperate girl sold to settle debts, she continued more quietly. I understand exactly how this looks to the kingdom. Lucian crossed toward her slowly. That is not what I meant. Then explain what you did mean. Dangerous question. Dangerous timing. Yet exhaustion stripped caution from her voice now. Lucian stopped directly in front of her. Close enough that the underground firelight turned his silver eyes almost pale gold around the edges. I meant, he said quietly, that they will underestimate you. The answer caught her off guard completely. Why? Because people mistake gentleness for weakness. His gaze held hers steadily. They will regret that eventually. Silence stretched between them while the underground chamber blurred quietly into the background again. Serafina became painfully aware of how close he stood. The warmth radiating from his coat still wrapped around her shoulders. The exhaustion hidden beneath his calm expression. The dangerous steadiness in the way he looked at her now. Not like a political inconvenience. Not like property. Something far more complicated. Gideon cleared his throat loudly nearby before things inside the room shifted into something impossible to ignore. Lucian stepped back first. Control returning instantly across his features. The storm is weakening, Gideon announced carefully while pretending not to notice the tension he interrupted. Outer patrols report no further movement. Lucian nodded once. Good. Yet before he turned away completely, his hand brushed lightly against Serafina's wrist again. Brief contact. Warm. Intentional enough that her pulse betrayed her immediately afterward. Lady Evermere definitely noticed. The older woman hid another sigh behind her wine glass. Dawn finally arrived weak and gray above Mordain Hall several hours later. The fortress slowly emerged from beneath the storm as servants reopened sealed corridors and guards resumed regular patrols across the snow-covered walls. Serafina returned upstairs alongside Mrs. Wren shortly after sunrise while exhausted nobles disappeared toward guest chambers throughout the estate. Mordain Hall looked different after surviving a night under siege. More honest somehow. Less like a mysterious aristocratic manor. More like a fortress built around dangerous men and necessary secrets. Broken glass still glittered across parts of the west corridor where attackers breached the wing earlier. Guards remained posted outside every staircase. Servants moved quietly with pale, tired faces. Nobody laughed. Nobody relaxed fully. Mrs. Wren guided Serafina back toward her chambers while morning light spilled faintly through the tall windows overlooking the cliffs. You should rest before the household meeting this afternoon. Serafina frowned slightly. Household meeting? Lucian intends to address the staff personally. That surprised her. Why? Mrs. Wren glanced toward the armed guards nearby before lowering her voice. Because after betrayal enters a house, loyalty must be chosen again openly. They reached the west wing moments later. Serafina stepped inside her chambers slowly and stopped short. Fresh flowers rested beside the windows. The broken hallway glass had already been replaced overnight. Even the fire burned warmly as though servants worked through dawn restoring calm before the estate fully woke. Then she noticed something else. A folded black coat placed carefully across the chair beside the fireplace. Lucian's coat. Cleaned. Repaired where snow and ash stained the fabric. Beside it rested a single handwritten note. Serafina crossed toward the chair slowly and unfolded the paper with careful fingers. The handwriting looked sharp and controlled. Eat before noon this time. You become argumentative when exhausted. For one stunned second, Serafina simply stared at the note. Then despite the sleepless night, despite the danger, despite everything, a quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. And somewhere beyond the west wing windows overlooking the frozen cliffs, hidden beneath all the fear and secrets surrounding Mordain Hall, something inside her heart began changing in ways far more dangerous than enemies outside the walls. By noon the storm had finally broken apart above the northern cliffs, leaving Mordain Hall wrapped beneath pale winter sunlight and fresh snow sharp enough to blind the eyes. The fortress looked deceptively peaceful from the west wing windows. White mountains stretching endlessly beneath silver skies. Smoke curling gently from stone chimneys. Guards moving steadily along restored patrol routes atop the walls. Yet beneath the calm, The entire estate carried tension like a pulse hidden beneath skin. Servants whispered more quietly now. Armed patrols doubled near every staircase. And somewhere inside the lower halls, a captured man waited chained beneath stone ceilings, while the most feared duke in the kingdom decided what truths still deserved mercy. Serafina stood near the windows fastening the final buttons of a dark green dress Mrs. Wren selected for the household assembly downstairs. The color deepened the gray in her eyes and softened the exhaustion lingering beneath them after the siege night. Yet no amount of elegant fabric changed the truth she still struggled accepting. She belonged here now, in Mordain Hall, beside Lucien Mordain. The realization frightened her more every day because part of her no longer wanted to leave. A soft knock sounded at the chamber doors. "Enter." Mrs. Wren stepped inside carrying fresh gloves and a folded shawl trimmed with silver embroidery. "The household has gathered." Serafina accepted the gloves slowly. "You speak about this assembly as though it matters more than breakfast." "It does." Mrs. Wren adjusted the shawl carefully around Serafina's shoulders. "The servants need to see stability after last night. And Lucien believes my presence helps with that?" The older woman hesitated briefly. "No." Serafina frowned slightly. Mrs. Wren met her eyes directly. "Lucien believes your absence would create panic." The answer unsettled her deeply. Before she could respond, distant bells echoed softly through the fortress corridors announcing midday. Mrs. Wren stepped aside toward the doors. "You should not keep the north waiting." The great hall below the western towers looked entirely different in daylight. Massive chandeliers burned warmly above polished black marble floors, while long windows flooded the chamber with pale winter sunlight reflected from the snow outside. Nearly the entire household had gathered. Servants lined the walls beside armed guards and estate officials. Nobles from the previous dinner stood near the front beneath banners carrying the silver crest of House Mordain. Conversation hushed immediately when Serafina entered alongside Mrs. Wren. Hundreds of eyes shifted toward her at once. Yet something had changed overnight. Before, the servants studied her with uncertainty, curiosity, some even pity. Today they looked at her differently, more carefully, more respectfully. Like surviving the siege beside Lucien altered her position inside the fortress completely. Gideon Mercer approached immediately from near the front rows. "My lady, you look exhausted," Serafina said quietly. Gideon almost smiled. "That makes two of us." He lowered his voice slightly while guiding her toward the front of the hall. "The prisoner confirmed one useful detail this morning." "Which is?" "Someone inside the royal court informed the attackers about your exact location within the West Wing." Cold moved slowly through her stomach again. "How would the royal court know where I sleep?" Gideon's expression darkened. "That is the question currently ruining everyone's mood." Before Serafina could answer, the massive hall doors opened behind the gathered crowd. Silence fell instantly across the chamber. Lucien entered alone. No cane, no false blindness. Just the Duke of Mordain crossing the hall with the kind of quiet authority that forced entire rooms to straighten without command. He wore black formal attire trimmed with silver at the collar and cuffs. Simple, severe. The scar along his jaw looked sharper beneath the daylight. Yet what unsettled Serafina most was the atmosphere changing around him the moment he entered. Fear existed there, yes, but also trust. The household looked at Lucien the way soldiers looked at walls surviving winter after winter. Lucien crossed toward the front of the chamber and stopped beneath the towering banners overlooking the assembly. His silver eyes swept slowly across the room once. Silence deepened further. "Last night," he began calmly, "Mordain Hall was breached by cowards who mistook snow and darkness for advantage. No raised voice, no dramatic fury. Yet every person listened like breathing itself required permission." Lucien continued quietly. "One guard betrayed patrol routes. 3 attackers reached the inner wall. None succeeded." Serafina watched the servants closely now. No shock crossed their faces, only grim understanding, as though danger belonged naturally to the north the same way winter did. Lucien clasped his hands loosely behind his back. "Some of you have served House Mordain for decades. Others arrived recently. His gaze shifted briefly toward Serafina, then returned toward the room. But understand this clearly. Betrayal inside these walls will always fail eventually. Silence settled again. Heavy. Absolute. Then Lucien said the words that changed the atmosphere inside the hall completely. Anyone who wishes to leave before spring may do so safely. No punishment. No consequence. Murmurs spread instantly through the gathered household. Even Gideon looked slightly surprised beside Serafina. Lucien remained perfectly still while the whispers rose and fell beneath the chandeliers. Finally, one older servant stepped forward from near the back rows. Gray-haired, thin, terrified. "My lord," the man said shakily. "My family has served Mordain Hall for 30 years. Lucien inclined his head once. "I know." The servant swallowed hard. "We are not leaving." Another servant stepped forward. Then another. One by one voices emerged throughout the hall. "Neither are we. Mordain protects its own. We stay." The pledges spread through the chamber slowly until dozens of servants stood openly reaffirming loyalty before the entire household. Serafina stared in stunned silence. This was not obedience built only on fear. Fear alone could not create devotion strong enough to survive nights like yesterday. Lucien listened quietly without visible emotion. Yet something subtle shifted around him with each vow spoken aloud. Loneliness, maybe, hidden deeply beneath all the control. The realization struck Serafina unexpectedly hard. He carried this entire fortress alone. Every burden, every threat, every life. Gideon leaned slightly toward her. "Now you understand why enemies never manage to destroy him. Because they are loyal?" Gideon's expression darkened thoughtfully. "Because Lucien spends years giving people reasons to survive beside him." Before Serafina could answer, sudden movement near the side entrance drew attention across the hall. Two guards escorted a young servant forward through the crowd. Barely older than 18. Pale. Shaking violently, Mrs. Wren stiffened immediately beside the wall. Lucien's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Gideon muttered softly beneath his breath. "Damn it!" The young servant collapsed to his knees near the front of the chamber. "Forgive me, my lord." Silence crashed through the room again. Serafina's pulse quickened painfully. Lucien stepped forward slowly. Calm. Terrifyingly calm. "You opened the western corridor," he said quietly. "Not question. Fact." The servant broke instantly into shaking tears. "They threatened my sister." No one moved. No one interrupted. The boy's voice cracked apart beneath panic and shame. "A man from the capital promised money. He said nobody would get hurt if I unlocked the passage after midnight." Lucien stopped directly before him. "Did you believe that?" The servant lowered his head completely. No. Silence stretched painfully through the great hall. Serafina watched Lucien carefully, waiting for anger to surface. Violence. Punishment. Instead, Lucien asked softly, "Where's your sister?" The servant blinked upward in confusion. "What? Your sister?" Lucien's voice remained perfectly even. "Where is she now?" "South District near Black Hollow." Lucien looked toward Gideon without turning his head fully. "Send riders. Bring her here before nightfall." The servant stared at him speechlessly. Gideon nodded immediately. "Understood." Serafina felt genuine shock move through the hall around her. The boy looked close to collapse beneath relief and confusion. "My lord," he whispered brokenly. "I betrayed you." Lucien's expression remained unreadable. "Yes. Then why?" Lucien interrupted quietly. "Because frightened people make desperate mistakes." His silver gaze sharpened slightly. "But men who threaten children to force betrayal deserve less mercy than you do." The entire chamber remained silent after that. Serafina felt something inside her chest tighten painfully. Cromir once called Lucien a monster. Yet monsters did not protect traitors' families from retaliation. Monsters did not carry entire fortresses through winter while giving frightened people second chances. The realization unsettled her more deeply than fear ever had. Lucien turned away from the kneeling servant afterward, as though the decision required no further thought. "The household assembly is finished," he said calmly. "Resume duties. Maintain doubled patrols until further notice." The crowd slowly began dispersing through the great hall. Servants moved quieter now, more emotional somehow. Several guards looked openly relieved. Mrs. Wren wiped discreetly at one eye before pretending dust caused the problem. Serafina remained near the front beneath the towering banners while Lucien spoke quietly with Gideon near the entrance doors. Sunlight moved silver across the marble floors between them. She watched him differently now. Not as the terrifying Duke from whispered northern stories. Not even as the man who lied about blindness and manipulated dangerous people. She watched him as someone profoundly tired trying desperately to keep other people alive. That felt far more dangerous to her heart. Gideon eventually disappeared toward the outer corridors carrying new orders. Lucien finally crossed back toward her through the thinning crowd. "You are staring again." Serafina folded her gloves carefully. "You spared him." "Yes. Most nobles would not. Most nobles are insecure enough to mistake cruelty for strength." The answer came instantly, automatic, as though he stopped questioning that truth years ago. Serafina searched his face quietly. "You frighten people anyway." A shadow of amusement touched his expression. "That is usually more efficient." Against her better judgment, she smiled slightly. Lucien noticed immediately. Of course he did. His gaze lingered on her face 1 second longer than necessary before softening almost invisibly. "There it is again. You say that often. Because you hide it often." Silence settled between them while servants passed quietly through the great hall around the edges of their conversation. Then Lucien spoke more quietly. "You should prepare for the journey south." Serafina's pulse faltered slightly. "The royal summons." "Yes. How long until we leave?" 3 days. Anxiety tightened slowly through her chest. "And when we arrive at court?" Lucien looked toward the enormous windows overlooking the frozen cliffs outside. "Then everyone dangerous in the kingdom will finally meet you properly." Not comforting. Somehow she appreciated that more. Before she could answer, another guard approached quickly from the eastern corridor carrying a sealed envelope marked with royal insignia. "Urgent delivery from the capital." Lucien accepted the letter immediately and broke the seal. Serafina watched his expression shift while reading. Not anger this time. Something colder. Gideon returned instantly the moment he saw Lucien's face. "What happened?" Lucien folded the letter slowly. "The queen moved the court gathering forward." "How far?" "Tomorrow night." Shock crossed Gideon's features openly now. "That is impossible." "No," Lucien's voice turned dangerously calm again. "It means she is afraid enough to stop waiting." Serafina looked between them uncertainly. "Afraid of what?" Lucien's silver gaze lifted toward her at last. "Of whoever decided you needed to disappear before spring." And for the first time since arriving at Mordain Hall, Serafina realized the truth fully. She was no longer trapped inside one dangerous man's world. She was about to walk directly into a kingdom built by them. The journey south began before sunrise beneath skies the color of cold steel. Mordain Hall disappeared slowly behind curtains of mountain fog, while black carriages rolled down frozen northern roads surrounded by armed riders carrying the silver crest of House Mordain. Serafina sat once again across from Lucien inside the main carriage, though this time nothing about the silence between them resembled strangers forced into marriage. Too much had happened. Too many truths survived between breaths now. Lucien rested beside the window dressed entirely in black formal wool trimmed with silver at the collar. One gloved hand held an unfolded letter from the royal court while the other remained loosely against the silver handle of his cane. The cane he no longer pretended to need. Snow drifted softly outside while the horses pulled them steadily south toward the capital and whatever waited there. Serafina watched the landscape blur beyond the carriage glass before finally speaking. "You have not slept." Lucien did not look up from the letter. "Neither have you. That is avoidance. That is observation." Despite everything, the corner of her mouth almost moved. Lucien noticed immediately, of course. He lowered the letter slowly. "There it is again." Serafina sighed softly. "You enjoy saying that far too much. You underestimate how rarely this carriage contains laughter." The answer landed strangely inside her chest. Quiet sadness hidden beneath dry amusement. Serafina studied him more carefully now beneath the weak morning light. The scar along his jaw looked sharper after several sleepless nights. Shadows lingered faintly beneath his eyes despite the calm control he carried so naturally. Even now, while reviewing royal summons and military reports during dangerous travel, part of his attention remained fixed outward toward the roads surrounding the carriage. Watching constantly, protecting constantly. She wondered suddenly when he last allowed himself to rest without expecting betrayal afterward. The thought hurt more than it should have. "What are you thinking about?" Lucien asked quietly. She blinked slightly. "How exhausting you must be." Genuine amusement flickered across his face this time. Brief but real. "That is probably fair." Outside the carriage, riders shifted positions along the snowy roads, while distant forests opened gradually into lower southern hills. They had traveled nearly 4 hours already without stopping. Gideon Mercer rode alongside the main carriage now rather than farther ahead scouting. That alone told Serafina enough about the danger surrounding this journey. Around midday the procession stopped briefly near a frozen river crossing while servants prepared fresh horses and hot tea beside the road. Serafina stepped carefully from the carriage wrapped in a dark winter cloak lined with silver fur. The cold southern wind felt almost warm compared to Mordain Hall's mountain storms. Guards immediately surrounded the resting area in practiced formation while Gideon reviewed maps near the lead riders. Lucien stood near the riverbank speaking quietly with 2 armed scouts when Serafina approached. Snow crunched softly beneath her boots. Lucien noticed her instantly without turning fully around. "You should stay closer to the carriages." "I needed air." "Air exists beside the carriages too." She folded her arms against the cold. "You become impossible whenever you are worried." Lucien dismissed the scouts with one quiet nod before finally facing her completely. "That suggests you already know me unusually well." The observation unsettled her enough that she looked toward the frozen river instead. Thin winter sunlight reflected silver across the ice while distant pine forests swayed beneath cold wind. For one quiet moment the road felt strangely peaceful. Then hoofbeats echoed sharply across the snow from the southern ridge. Every guard reacted instantly. Rifles lifted. Hands moved toward holsters. Gideon turned sharply beside the lead carriage while Lucien stepped subtly closer toward Serafina without seeming to move at all. A single rider approached through the trees carrying white royal banners above his horse. "Messenger." The tension eased slightly. Slightly. The rider dismounted quickly upon reaching the road and crossed directly toward Lucien. "Your Grace." He handed over a sealed envelope stamped with the royal crest. Lucien broke the seal immediately while the messenger continued carefully. "Additional orders from the palace." Serafina watched Lucien's expression darken while reading. "Interesting timing." Gideon approached immediately. "What happened?" Lucien folded the letter once. "The Queen cancelled tomorrow's public court assembly." "Cancelled?" Gideon frowned sharply. "Why?" Lucien's silver gaze lifted toward the southern road stretching beyond the frozen hills. "Because someone attempted to poison 2 royal advisors last night." Cold silence spread instantly among the nearby guards. Serafina felt her stomach tighten painfully. "Were they killed?" "No." Lucien handed the letter toward Gideon. "But whoever planned it wanted panic before the gathering." Gideon scanned the message quickly. "This is escalating too fast." "Yes." Lucien's voice softened dangerously. "Which means we are already late." Before Serafina could ask more, another rider approached rapidly from the rear escort line. One of Mordain Hall's own guards. Pale. Breathless. "My lord." Lucien turned immediately. "Report." "We intercepted a courier 3 miles north carrying coded documents." The guard hesitated briefly. One of the names mentioned repeatedly was Lady Mordain. Serafina froze. Lucien's expression became unreadable again. "Where is the courier now?" "Secured with the rear escort." Lucien nodded once. "Bring the documents to me after nightfall." The guard obeyed instantly and rode back toward the escort lines. Snow drifted quietly across the frozen road afterward while tension settled heavily around the stopped procession. Serafina looked toward Lucien carefully. "I still do not understand why this is happening." Lucien's gaze remained fixed somewhere beyond the southern hills. "Neither do I." The honesty startled her. You admit uncertainty? Only when necessary. His silver eyes finally returned toward her. Whatever threatens you involves the royal court, Cromir, and at least one northern betrayal network. That sounds catastrophic. It usually is. Before she could answer, Lucian stepped unexpectedly closer. Wind moved softly through dark strands of hair across his forehead, while snow gathered lightly against the shoulders of his coat. Listen carefully, he said quietly. When we reach the capital, do not trust anyone immediately. Not nobles. Not servants. Not even people carrying royal insignia. Serafina searched his face beneath the pale winter light. You truly believe the palace itself is dangerous? I believe power becomes dangerous whenever frightened people begin losing control of it. The answer stayed with her long after the journey resumed southward. By evening the landscape had transformed completely. Northern cliffs gave way to rolling valleys lined with frozen rivers, small villages, and distant church towers rising beneath gray skies. More travelers appeared along the roads now. Merchants, supply wagons, military escorts wearing royal colors. Several recognized the silver crest of House Mordain immediately and moved aside with visible unease. Serafina noticed every reaction. The lowered eyes, the whispered conversations after the carriages passed. Lucian's reputation traveled faster than the horses carrying him. They stopped shortly after sunset at an enormous roadside estate reserved for royal guests traveling toward the capital. Warm lanterns glowed across polished stone courtyards, while armed attendants hurried forward to greet the arriving procession. Yet despite the luxury surrounding them, the atmosphere remained tense. Too many guards, too many locked entrances. Even the servants looked frightened. Gideon noticed it too. Something happened here recently. Lucian stepped down from the carriage slowly while scanning the estate grounds. Yes. How can you tell? Serafina asked quietly beside him. Lucian's gaze shifted briefly toward the windows overlooking the courtyard. Nobody laughs. The answer chilled her more than the cold wind. Inside, the estate resembled a smaller version of Mordain Hall. Elegant corridors, marble staircases, firelight flickering against expensive paintings. Yet fear lingered beneath the beauty like smoke trapped inside walls. Servants moved too carefully. Conversations stopped too quickly whenever royal officials crossed the hallways. A young attendant guided Lucian and Serafina toward private chambers on the upper floor, while guards secured the surrounding corridors. The royal delegation from the capital arrived an hour ago, the attendant explained nervously. They requested a private audience with your grace after dinner. Gideon immediately stiffened behind them. Lucian's expression revealed nothing. Which delegation? Lord Minister Halbrecht himself, sir. Serafina felt the shift around them instantly. Even the attendant looked afraid speaking the name aloud. Once inside the private chambers, Gideon closed the doors sharply behind them. Halbrecht should still be in the capital. Lucian removed his gloves slowly beside the fire. Exactly. You think the Queen sent him? No, Lucian's silver eyes darkened slightly. I think Halbrecht came because someone else already moved first. Serafina crossed slowly toward the windows overlooking the estate courtyard below. Additional royal carriages lined the entrance now beneath torchlight and armed patrols. Who is Halbrecht? Gideon answered grimly before Lucian could. The most dangerous political strategist in the kingdom. A cold feeling settled immediately beneath her ribs. More dangerous than Cromir? Gideon nearly laughed without humor. Cromir destroys people loudly. Halbrecht prefers removing them quietly enough that nobody notices until funerals begin. Silence followed. Lucian crossed toward the fireplace while shadows flickered across his face beneath the warm light. We leave before dawn tomorrow. Gideon frowned sharply. Without attending the royal audience? Especially without attending it. Serafina turned from the window immediately. You can refuse royal officials? Lucian met her eyes calmly. Watch me. Despite the danger surrounding them, another quiet laugh nearly escaped her. Impossible, man. Even now. Gideon muttered something about arrogance and political disasters before leaving to secure the escort routes downstairs. Once the doors closed behind him, Silence settled through the private chambers again, softer this time, more personal. Serafina stood near the windows while Lucien remained beside the fire removing documents from inside his coat. Finally she spoke quietly. "You are afraid." Lucien paused briefly. "Observant. You hide it well. Fear is more useful when controlled." She crossed slowly toward him through the warm firelight. "What are you afraid of?" Long silence answered first. Then Lucien folded one of the royal letters carefully and looked toward her fully. "That someone spent months planning around your existence before either of us understood why." The honesty landed heavily between them. Serafina stopped beside the fireplace. Close enough now to feel the warmth radiating from him beneath the cold exhaustion lingering around both of them. "You keep protecting me," she said softly, "even though I complicate your life." Lucien studied her another long moment. Firelight moved gold across his silver eyes. "No," he answered quietly. "You are the first honest thing that has entered my life in years." Her breath caught painfully. The silence afterward changed shape entirely. Dangerous now. Intimate in ways neither of them seemed prepared for. Lucien reached toward her almost absently, then stopped himself halfway. Control returning instantly across his features. Serafina noticed anyway. So did he. Neither spoke. Then suddenly 3 sharp knocks echoed against the private chamber doors. Hard. Official. Lucien's entire posture shifted at once. Cold again. Controlled. A voice called from the hallway beyond. "Royal authority. Open immediately." Serafina's pulse stumbled. Lucien's expression hardened into something terrifyingly calm. He reached slowly beneath his coat toward the pistol holstered there. Then he looked directly at her and said the words that turned the warm firelit room suddenly cold. "Stay behind me no matter what happens next." The knocking came again. Harder this time. 3 sharp strikes against the private chamber doors that echoed through the firelit room like a countdown neither of them could stop. Serafina stood frozen beside the fireplace while Lucien moved silently between her and the entrance without another word. One hand rested beneath his coat near the pistol hidden there. The other remained loose at his side. Calm. Controlled. Dangerous in the way storms looked dangerous before mountains disappeared beneath them. "Royal authority," the voice repeated from the hallway. "Open now." Lucien's silver eyes never left the doors. Interesting choice of tone. Serafina's pulse hammered painfully against her ribs. "Who is it?" "Someone hoping intimidation still works on me." Before she could answer, Lucien crossed toward the entrance and unlocked the doors himself. The moment they opened, 4 royal guards appeared in the hallway dressed in dark crimson military coats trimmed with gold insignia. Armed. Tense. Behind them stood a tall older man with silver-streaked hair and cold intelligent eyes sharp enough to strip weakness bare from a room in seconds. Lord Minister Halbrecht. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Serafina understood at once why Gideon called him dangerous. Halbrecht carried power quietly, the kind built through secrets rather than battlefields. His gaze moved past Lucien immediately and settled on Serafina with unsettling precision. "Lady Mordain." Lucien stepped slightly farther into the doorway. Small movement. Clear message. "You arrive late for polite conversation." Halbrecht's expression did not change. "You ignored royal summons." "I was considering making it a tradition." One of the guards stiffened visibly at the answer. Halbrecht only folded his gloves carefully between long pale fingers. "May we enter?" No silence hit the hallway sharply. Serafina nearly stopped breathing. Even the guards looked startled by the refusal. Halbrecht studied Lucien another long moment before speaking more quietly. "You are making this unnecessarily difficult. You arrived armed outside private chambers after midnight." Lucien's voice remained calm. "You eliminated unnecessary difficulty yourself." For several dangerous seconds, nobody moved. Then, unexpectedly, Halbrecht exhaled softly through his nose. Not amusement exactly. Recognition, maybe. "Very well," he said. "Then we speak here." Lucien did not lower his guard even slightly. Briefly, Halbrecht's eyes shifted toward Serafina again. "Your wife is creating considerable concern inside the capital." "That sounds like a problem for the capital." No, Halbrecht's expression hardened faintly. It becomes your problem when people start dying around her name. Serafina felt cold move slowly beneath her skin. Lucien's voice lowered dangerously. Choose your next sentence carefully. Halbrecht met his gaze without blinking. 3 royal officials were poisoned this week. 2 northern couriers vanished. A coded network tied to Blackmere Ridge reactivated after 8 years of silence. The minister paused deliberately. And every thread currently leads toward your marriage. Silence swallowed the corridor whole. Serafina looked sharply toward Lucien. Blackmere Ridge again. Always that name returning beneath the surface of everything. Halbrecht continued quietly. The Queen believes someone inside the royal court fears Lady Mordain enough to destabilize half the kingdom before spring. And your solution? Lucien asked. Protective custody inside the royal palace until investigations conclude. Serafina stared openly now. Protective custody? Halbrecht finally looked directly at her. You are safer at court than traveling exposed roads while political factions hunt your movements. No, Lucien answered flatly. The refusal came instantly. Absolute. Halbrecht's attention shifted back toward him slowly. You did not even allow her to answer. Because the answer remains no. Tension sharpened visibly among the guards. One shifted his stance near the doorway before Halbrecht lifted one finger slightly without looking at him. Immediate stillness returned. Power recognized power. Serafina watched both men carefully. 2 different kinds of danger standing 3 feet apart. Lucien built from storms and survival. Halbrecht built from politics and buried truths. You are becoming emotional, Halbrecht observed quietly. Lucien's silver eyes darkened almost imperceptibly. You are becoming tiresome. For the first time, something flickered beneath Halbrecht's controlled expression. Not fear, caution. The Queen anticipated resistance. Then she knows me well. She also requested I remind you of Winter Act 17. The words hit like ice through the corridor. Lucien went completely still. Not visibly angry. Worse, empty. Gideon had once described Lucien as a man who survived wars by becoming colder than the people trying to destroy him. Serafina finally understood what that meant. What is Winter Act 17? She asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Halbrecht watched Lucien carefully before speaking himself. An emergency wartime decree. His voice remained measured. It grants the Crown temporary authority over individuals deemed essential to national security. Serafina's stomach tightened painfully. Individuals. Halbrecht looked directly at her. Including spouses connected to unresolved military operations. Silence crashed through the hallway. Lucien stepped fully between them now. No subtlety left. Pure protection. You are not touching her. Every guard in the corridor visibly tensed. Halbrecht's gaze remained fixed steadily on Lucien. You mistake me for your enemy. No, Lucien's voice softened dangerously. I simply remember how quickly the capital sacrifices innocent people whenever powerful men panic. Halbrecht did not deny it. That frightened Serafina more than argument would have. Finally, the minister spoke again. There are older forces moving beneath this situation than you realize. Then explain them. Not here. Halbrecht glanced briefly toward the surrounding guards. Walls inside royal estates rarely remain loyal for long. Lucien's expression revealed nothing. Yet Serafina noticed something subtle. He was listening now. Truly listening. Halbrecht lowered his voice further. 8 years ago at Blackmere Ridge, someone disappeared before the final battle concluded. Serafina saw the exact moment the conversation changed. Lucien's entire body sharpened almost invisibly. Careful, he said quietly. Halbrecht ignored the warning. The Crown believed that problem buried permanently. His gaze shifted toward Serafina again. Apparently it survived long enough to find her. Cold spread through Serafina's chest. I do not understand. Halbrecht answered softly. No. Which is precisely why you are dangerous. Before she could press further, heavy footsteps thundered suddenly through the lower hallway staircase. Gideon Mercer appeared moments later carrying visible fury across his face. Armed riders flooded the corridor behind him. Mordain guards. Halbrecht's royal escort immediately reached toward their weapons. Lucien raised one hand slightly without looking away from Halbrecht. Everyone froze instantly. Gideon stopped beside Lucien, breathing hard from speed and anger. We intercepted another coded message. His eyes shifted briefly toward Halbrecht with open distrust. Someone leaked our route from inside the royal delegation. The corridor erupted into tension again. Halbrecht's expression darkened. Impossible. No, Gideon answered coldly. Just inconvenient for you. Lucien extended one hand. Gideon immediately passed over the intercepted document. Serafina watched Lucien scan the coded page once before something colder than anger entered his expression. Interesting. What? Gideon asked. Lucien folded the paper slowly. The leak did not target our location. His silver gaze lifted toward Serafina. It targeted her real name. Silence swallowed the corridor whole. Serafina frowned slightly. My real name? Halbrecht stepped forward before Lucien could stop him. What was your mother's maiden name? The question startled her completely. Why? Answer. Serafina swallowed once. Esther. Halbrecht closed his eyes briefly. Real fear crossed his face for the first time all night. Gideon looked openly confused beside them. Lucien did not move at all. Yet Serafina suddenly understood something terrible from the silence alone. He already knew. Lucien, she whispered. His gaze shifted toward her slowly, too carefully. What is happening? Long silence followed. Outside the estate windows, winter wind rattled faintly against distant glass, while armed men stood motionless in the corridor waiting for someone powerful enough to decide what came next. Finally, Halbrecht spoke quietly into the stillness. 8 years ago, during the Blackmere campaign, the crown hunted a traitor carrying documents capable of collapsing half the royal bloodlines in the kingdom. Serafina's pulse quickened painfully. What does that have to do with me? Halbrecht's expression turned grim. The traitor vanished before execution. Lucien's jaw tightened once. Enough. But Halbrecht continued anyway. His last known contact before disappearing was a southern woman named Eleanor Astor. The world tilted beneath Serafina's feet. Her mother, dead for nearly 10 years. Impossible. No, she whispered automatically. That cannot. Halbrecht interrupted softly. The coded documents intercepted tonight carried the phrase Astor Air repeatedly. Silence crashed through the corridor like breaking ice. Serafina looked toward Lucien in horror. You knew. His expression finally cracked. Small, painful, honest. Not at first. But eventually you did. Lucien stepped toward her slowly. Serafina, that is why Cromir wanted me. The realization hit like cold iron through her chest. Not because of debts. Because of my mother. Nobody denied it. Nobody could. Serafina backed away instinctively. Every truth from the last 2 weeks suddenly rearranged itself into something far larger and more terrifying than she imagined. The marriage. The attacks. The royal court. None of it happened accidentally. She was never simply a desperate girl sold to survive winter. She had been hunted long before she met Lucien Mordain. He crossed toward her carefully. Listen to me. You married me because I was dangerous. Pain flickered openly behind his silver eyes now. Real pain. No, then why? The question broke from her before she could stop it. Exhausted. Lucien stopped directly in front of her beneath the corridor lantern light while armed guards and political monsters waited silently around them. His voice lowered almost to nothing. Because after I learned the truth, he said softly, you were the only thing in years that made me remember I was still human. The words stole the breath from her lungs completely. Silence followed. Heavy. Trembling. Honest in ways neither of them could survive unchanged. Then suddenly another guard appeared at the far staircase shouting breathlessly through the corridor. Riders approaching from the southern road. Gideon turned sharply. Whose riders? The guard looked toward Halbrecht with visible panic. Royal banners. Halbrecht frowned immediately. That is impossible. My escort already arrived. The guard swallowed hard. These banners belong directly to the Queen. Every person in the corridor went still. Lucien's expression darkened instantly. Halbrecht muttered one quiet curse beneath his breath. Then the guard delivered the final sentence that changed everything forever. And according to the advance messenger, he said shakily, Her Majesty is demanding to meet Lady Mordain personally before sunrise.